Miriam's thumbs were stained a faint, stubborn yellow from the turmeric. It didn't matter how much lemon juice she rubbed into her skin, the spice lived under her nails now, a permanent ledger of the 92 plates she had prepped, cooked, and scraped clean since Friday morning. The cast-iron pot, an 8-quart double-handled monster that Grandma Beatrice had seasoned with lard in the late 1940s, sat in the deep ceramic sink. It was too heavy for the modern brass faucet, which groaned slightly whenever the iron nudged against its neck. The grease from the braised short ribs had cooled into a thick, pale ring around the rim. Miriam kept the water running just hot enough to steam, the vapor carrying the heavy, slightly sour scent of caramelized onions and stale beef fat up into her face. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar heat. In the dining room, 30 feet away, the light was different. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaded glass windows, cutting amber bars across the long oak table. Eleanor Vance sat at the head, her posture as rigid and elegant as it had been 40 years ago when she ran the front of house for the family's original bistro. To her right, Sophia was tapping her manicured nails against the edge of a thick, heavy-bound book. "The matte finish was definitely the right choice, Mom," Sophia said. Her voice had that airy, effortless carry of someone who had never had to project over the roar of a commercial hood vent. "It feels organic, very artisanal." Chloe, lounging in the adjacent armchair with her ankles crossed, didn't look up from her iPad. "I told you, glossy looks like a supermarket flyer. This actually looks like our heritage." Miriam squeezed another drop of blue dish soap onto the scrub pad. The sponge was losing its grit, the yellow foam turning a limp, greasy gray. The green scrubbers were in the pantry, third shelf behind the canned tomatoes. To get them, Miriam would have to walk past the dining table. She would have to cross the threshold of their light. Instead, she worked with the dead sponge, pressing her weight down through her shoulders to shift the carbonized sugars at the bottom of the pot. Beatrice had died 5 years ago. In her final months, her mind had frayed like the edges of her favorite gingham aprons, but her hands had kept the rhythm of the kitchen. She would sit in her vinyl armchair, her swollen fingers mimicking the crimping of pie crusts in the empty air. The daughters, Sophia and Chloe, had visited on Sundays, bringing store-bought lilies and staying for 20 minutes before complaining about the smell of mothballs and boiled cabbage. It was Miriam who had sat with her. Miriam who had brought a yellow legal pad and watched Beatrice's hands, translating the frantic, wordless gestures into tablespoons and grams. "A pinch of salt is only a pinch if your hands are small, Miriam," Beatrice had whispered once, her eyes cloudy but sharp. "Eleanor has big, clumsy hands. She ruins the yeast. Don't let her touch the pastry." And Miriam hadn't. For 5 years, she had been the sole keeper of the dough, the stocks, and the sauces that kept the Vance family name alive in the valley. "Miriam, honey?" It was Eleanor. Her voice was polite, perfectly modulated, the tone she used when asking a server for extra bread. She didn't turn her head toward the kitchen. She was tracing the embossed gold lettering on the book's cover with her thumb. "Yes, Eleanor?" Miriam didn't turn off the tap. The sound of rushing water was a shield, small but necessary. "Did we end up using the Meyer lemons or the standard Lisbon ones for the fig compote recipe on page 84. Sophia is just double-checking the glossary. Miriam's wrist paused. The fig compote. Beatrice had never written down the ratio. She had simply said, "Until it looks like a wet leather boot, Miriam, then you drop the peel in." It had taken Miriam 4 distinct autumns, 80 pounds of black mission figs, and 3 ruined copper pots to translate wet leather into 185 degrees Fahrenheit for exactly 22 minutes. "The Meyer lemons," Miriam said, her voice level. "The Lisbons have too much pith. They make the skin bitter after 3 weeks in the jar." "Meyer lemons," Sophia repeated, her fingers dancing over her phone as she took notes. She didn't look at Miriam. "Perfect. I'll make sure the editor updates the index before the final print run next week. We want the launch to be seamless." "It's going to be beautiful, Soph," Chloe murmured, finally shifting her weight. "The local paper is already asking for an advanced copy. They want to do a full spread on the Vance daughters, keeping the fire alive. They loved the story about you two sitting at Beatrice's knee while she cooked." Miriam's thumb pressed hard against the iron rim. A small splinter of steel wool, trapped in the sponge, found its way under her thumbnail. It was a tiny, sharp bite of pain. She didn't flinch. She simply watched the water pool in the center of the pot, turning from clear to a muddy, yellow-tinted broth. She calculated the distance to the trash can. 5 steps. The energy required to drop the sponge, dry her hands, walk into the dining room, and ask to see the book she had spent 18 months dictating, testing, and photographing was immense. It would require her to look at Sophia's clean, uncalloused hands. It would require her to see her own recipes, the ones she had painstakingly standardized while her husband David slept upstairs, bound under a title that did not carry her name. "Let it slide," the internal voice whispered. It was the same voice that told her to ignore the grease stains on the ceiling, the way David forgot their anniversary but remembered his mother's dry cleaning schedule, the way the family spoke around her rather than to her. Save the breath. "You still have to scale the sea bass for tomorrow's catering order." "David's putting the boxes in the garage," Eleanor said, her eyes still fixed on the gold leaf lettering. "He says we have 300 copies for the local pre-sales. Miriam, make sure he doesn't stack them against the damp wall near the boiler." "I'll tell him," Miriam said. She lifted the 20-pound iron pot out of the sink. Her forearms trembled slightly under the weight, the wet metal slipping against her soapy palms. She set it on the drying rack with a heavy, hollow clunk that vibrated through the old pine cabinetry. The kitchen was growing darker now, the shadows stretching from the corner pantry toward her feet. In the dining room, Sophia laughed at something on her screen, a bright, clear sound that belonged to a world where hands stayed soft and clean. The heavy fire door to the garage groaned on its spring, letting in a draft of damp evening air that smelled of wet pine needles and motor oil. David stood in the doorway, his chest heaving slightly under his gray fleece pullover. He was holding an empty plastic packing crate under one arm. "That's the last of the pre-sale boxes," David said, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He didn't look directly at Miriam. His eyes flicked toward the dining room, where the low hum of his mother's and sister's voices continued without a break. "Mom wants them kept in the hallway pantry instead of the garage. She's worried the humidity will warp the covers before the signing on Friday." Miriam didn't stop her hands. She was using a stainless steel bench scraper to clear the dried dough crust from the heavy maple butcher block. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The pale, paper-thin flakes of flour and dried yeast accumulated in a small, neat pile under the blade. "I told her the garage was dry enough," David continued, stepping into the kitchen and letting the heavy door click shut behind him. He smelled of cardboard dust and the cold. "But you know how she gets when she has an idea. It's easier to just move them." He reached past Miriam to grab a glass from the cupboard. His shoulder brushed against hers, a brief, familiar pressure that usually anchored her. Today it felt light, almost weightless, like a dry leaf scraping against bark. "Did you put the heavy ones on the bottom?" Miriam asked, her voice dropping into the rhythmic cadence of the kitchen scraper. Scritch. "Yeah, the ones with the hardback sleeves." David took a long drink of tap water, his throat clicking as he swallowed. He set the glass down on the damp counter, right next to the freshly washed cast-iron pot, leaving a wet ring on the clean wood. "Sophia looks great, doesn't she? She's really worked her tail off on the marketing for this. She's got 3 local shops lined up to display the book in their front windows by Wednesday." Miriam looked at the wet ring on the butcher block. The wood was thirsty. It needed a fresh coat of mineral oil, something she usually did on Sunday nights after everyone left. She calculated the energy required to pick up the rag, dry the glass, wipe the ring, and explain to David that Sophia's marketing consisted of 3 phone calls to people she had gone to high school with, while Miriam had spent 48 hours straight testing the yeast ratios for the brioche recipe so the photos wouldn't look flat. Instead, she simply gathered the scraped dough flakes into her palm. "Sophia is very good at talking to people." "She is," David agreed, completely missing the flat line of her tone. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that made him look younger than 36. He really loved his family. He loved the idea of them, the grand Vance legacy, the century-old name, the warmth of the Sunday dinners his grandmother had started and his wife now maintained. "It's a big deal, Mir. First print run is 5,000 copies. The publisher thinks we might have to do a second run before Thanksgiving." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, smoothing it out on the counter over the wet ring. It was a printout of a digital spreadsheet. "Mom wanted me to give you this," David said, his voice dropping slightly, adopting that quiet, administrative tone he used when he was trying to be efficient for his mother. "It's the prep list for the launch party on Thursday night. She wants to do it in the garden at the old house. We're expecting about 80 people, mostly local press, some of the Historic Society board members, and the boutique owners." Miriam didn't touch the paper. She looked at the neat, laser-printed columns. 150 caramelized onion and Gruyere tartlets, Beatrice's pastry dough. 100 miniature lemon curd tartlets. 80 smoked trout mousse crostini. 4 large platters of rosemary olive focaccia. At the bottom of the page, in Eleanor's sharp, elegant cursive, was a handwritten note. "Miriam, please ensure the pastry is rolled thin this time. The last batch at Easter was slightly heavy." 80 people, Miriam said quietly. "Yeah, just a light grazing menu," David said, tapping the paper. "Nothing too crazy. Mom figured you could get most of the pastry shells done on Tuesday night after work, and then just fill them on Thursday afternoon. I can help you carry the trays over to the old house before the guests arrive." He was looking at her now, his eyes bright with the innocent, unburdened expectation of a man who had never rolled 300 individual tartlet shells by hand. He didn't see the tiny red cracks around her knuckles. He didn't see the brace she wore on her right wrist when she slept. To him, the food simply appeared, a natural consequence of Sunday afternoons, as inevitable as the sunset. "And who was hosting the kitchen during the party?" Miriam asked. "Oh, we'll have a couple of Sophia's friends from the junior league helping to pass the trays," David said, turning to look back toward the dining room. "But Mom wants you in the kitchen to make sure the hot things stay hot and the platters are refilled. You know how she is about presentation. She doesn't trust the girls to keep the timing right." From the dining room, the sound of a chair scraping against the floorboards signaled the end of the meeting. "David?" Eleanor's voice called out, sharp and clear. "Did you find that packing tape? We need to seal the promotional mailers before the post office opens tomorrow." "Coming, Mom," David called back. He gave Miriam's shoulder a quick, affectionate squeeze. "Thanks, babe. You're a lifesaver. This launch is going to put the family back on the map." He disappeared back into the warm amber light of the dining room, leaving the kitchen door to swing shut behind him. Miriam stood alone in the darkening room. The hum of the sub-zero refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the silence, a low mechanical vibration that matched the steady throbbing in her lower back. She looked down at the prep list on the counter. The paper was already beginning to absorb the water from the wet ring David had left, the black ink of Eleanor's cursive note bleeding slowly into the white page, turning the sharp, elegant letters into a soft, blurry gray. The front door finally clicked shut at 9:30. Through the small, high window in the hallway, Miriam watched the headlights of Eleanor's sedan sweep across the dark hemlocks at the edge of the driveway, followed closely by the red taillights of Sophia's crossover. The gravel crunched under their tires, a dry, receding sound that left the house suddenly, aggressively quiet. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. David was already in his flannel pajama pants, brushing his teeth. The rhythmic, muffled buzz of his electric toothbrush vibrated through the ceiling of the kitchen. Miriam stood in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the evening. The air was heavy with the smell of expensive perfume, stale Pinot Noir, and the lingering, sweet, sharp scent of the roasted pear tart she had served for dessert. The mahogany table, which had belonged to David's grandfather, was mapped with damp rings, crumpled linen napkins, and small drifts of salt from the breadboard. She began to clear. She didn't use a tray. She preferred the slow, singular transit of carrying things by hand. 2 wine glasses in her left hand, their stems slipped between her fingers, 1 plate in her right. Sophia's glass still had a crescent of dark plum lipstick on the rim. Miriam stared at it as she walked into the kitchen. The wax in the lipstick had bonded with the glass. It would require hot water and a firm rub with a dry towel to dissolve. She set the glasses in the sink, the crystal clinking softly against the cast-iron pot she had washed earlier. When she returned to the dining room for the 3rd time, she saw it. Sophia had left the book mock-up on the sideboard, right next to the empty silver breadbasket. It sat on the dark wood like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. On the cover, a square of yellow adhesive paper was stuck to the matte laminate. In Sophia's large, looping handwriting, the note read, "Miriam, could you quickly check the yeast measurements for the brioche on page 98 and the bake time for the rosemary crackers on page 142? The editor needs the final corrections by 9 a.m. tomorrow. You're the best. Kissix, Soph. Miriam stood perfectly still. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room gave its deep, mechanical whir before striking the quarter hour. Tick, tick, tick. She did not pull the sticky note off. Instead, she extended her hand, her fingers dry and rough from the dishwater, and opened the heavy cover. The paper was thick, high-quality stock that felt cold to the touch. The title page read, "The Vance Family Table, Traditions, Recipes, and Wisdom, Passed Down Through Generations of Vance Women." Directly beneath the title, the authors' names were printed in a clean, modern serif font. Sophia Vance and Chloe Vance with Eleanor Vance. Miriam's hand remained on the margin of the page. She didn't turn it immediately. She looked at her thumb, yellowed from the turmeric, resting next to Sophia's printed name. Slowly, her fingers turned the sheet. The paper made a soft, expensive rustle in the quiet room. Introduction: The Living Heritage. She read the first paragraph. Eleanor's voice leaped off the page, elegant and slightly performative. "We have always been a family defined by the hearth. My mother, Beatrice Vance, understood that food is not merely sustenance, it is a contract. As young girls, my daughters, Sophia and Chloe, sat on high stools in her kitchen, their small hands covered in flour, learning the sacred measurements of her famous crusts. This book is their tribute to that lineage, a preservation of the maternal flame that has kept our family whole for over a century." Miriam's eyes stopped on the words maternal flame. She remembered Sophia at 22, coming home from college for Thanksgiving, refuse bagging her laundry and leaving it in the hallway while she complained that the smell of Beatrice's roasting turkey made her hair greasy. She remembered Chloe, who had once thrown a physical tantrum on the kitchen floor because Beatrice had asked her to peel 3 pounds of hot-boiled potatoes for the gnocchi. "They don't have the stomach for it, Miriam," Beatrice had whispered that afternoon, her apron stained with gray starch as she watched Chloe storm out of the house. "They want the plate, but they don't want the dirt. Don't give them the dirt." But Miriam had given it to them anyway. She had standardized the gnocchi recipe. She had spent 3 weeks measuring the moisture content of different potato varieties so the recipe wouldn't fail for a home cook using a standard grocery store russet. She turned to the back of the book, the acknowledgments page. Her eyes scanned the neat blocks of text. The publisher's design team, the assistant editor, the local butcher who had provided the marrow bones for the cover shoot, the family's accountant, the photographer who had taken the headshots of Sophia and Chloe laughing over a bowl of unpeeled peaches. Her name was not there. There was a thank you to David Vance for his endless support and for keeping the wine glasses full during our late-night writing sessions. Miriam closed the book. The cover fell shut with a quiet, dull thud. Upstairs, the electric toothbrush stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, pressing down on the corners of the room. She looked at the yellow sticky note. Corrections by 9 a.m. tomorrow. She calculated the time. It was 9:45. If she opened the manuscript, pulled out her old notebooks, and verified the brioche ratios, which she had altered 3 times to account for the difference in modern commercial yeast potencies. It would take her until midnight. She would go to bed with her shoulders knotted, her head aching from the glare of the kitchen light. And if she didn't, Sophia would call her at 8:30 in a panic, her voice sweet but sharp, with the implicit accusation that Miriam was being difficult. Eleanor would make a quiet remark during next Sunday's dinner about how important accuracy was for the Vance name. Miriam took a slow, deep breath, her ribs expanding against the linen of her apron. She reached out, peeled the yellow sticky note from the matte cover, crumpled it into a tiny ball, and dropped it into the empty silver breadbasket. She left the book on the sideboard, exactly where Sophia had left it. She didn't open it again. Turning off the dining room chandelier, she walked back into the dark kitchen, the floorboards cold beneath her socks. The kitchen was 60 degrees at 5:30 in the morning. David kept a strict rule about the thermostat, adjusting it every night before bed to save on the heating bill, a habit he'd inherited from his father. Miriam's breath didn't quite fog in the air, but her fingers were stiff as she reached for the matchbox beside the stove. She struck a match. The small, sulphurous scratch flared bright in the blue-gray dawn, illuminating the grease-splattered tile behind the range. She held the flame to the brass burner until the ring of tiny blue jets hissed to life, then set the old copper kettle over the heat. While the water heated, she began her morning routine. It was a sequence of movements so deeply grooved into her muscle memory that she could have done them blind. Scoop the dark, oily coffee beans into the manual hand grinder. Set the grind to medium coarse. Turn the crank. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The physical resistance of the beans vibrating through the wooden box of the grinder was a comfort. It was a predictable weight, a predictable effort. She looked out the small window above the sink. The hemlocks in the backyard were dark silhouettes against a pale, bruised sky. Condensation had formed in the corners of the glass panes, cold and wet. She ran her forefinger through a bead of moisture, leaving a clear streak. "Morning," David muttered from the doorway. He was half-dressed, his striped tie hanging unknotted around his neck like a deflated snake. He was holding his leather briefcase in one hand and rubbing his eyes with the other. His hair was still damp from the shower, smelling of the pine-scented soap he liked. "Morning," Miriam said. She didn't turn around. She kept cranking the grinder. Crunch, crunch. "Did you get a chance to look at those pages for Soph?" David asked, his voice thick with sleep. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table and walked over to the stove, warming his hands near the burner. "She text-spammed me at midnight. She's really sweating that 9 o'clock deadline. Apparently the publisher's layout team is waiting on her." Miriam stopped grinding. The silence that filled the kitchen was sudden and sharp. "I saw the note," she said. "And?" David looked at her, his expression mild, expectant. He reached for his travel mug, which she had washed and left on the drying rack the night before. "Were the measurements okay?" Miriam looked down at the wooden grinder in her hands. She calculated the energy of an argument at 5:45 in the morning. She calculated the weight of the words required to explain that Grandma Beatrice's brioche recipe, the one Sophia had insisted on printing exactly as Grandma made it for the sake of historical charm, used fresh cake yeast. If a modern home cook tried to make that recipe using the active dry yeast found in standard grocery stores, using Beatrice's original wet ingredient ratios, the dough would never rise properly. It would turn into a dense, heavy brick that smelled faintly of sour beer. Miriam had spent 3 weeks in the winter of 2022 adjusting those liquid-to-solid ratios to make the recipe foolproof for the modern kitchen. But her standardized version was in the blue leather notebook under her nightstand. The mock-up Sophia had left on the sideboard contained only Beatrice's unadjusted, raw notes, the ones Sophia had copied from the old index cards behind Miriam's back. The yeast ratio in the mock-up is Beatrice's original, Miriam said, her voice even, completely devoid of inflection. Great, David said, nodding as he unscrewed the lid of his travel mug. He didn't know the difference between cake yeast and dry yeast. To him, yeast was yeast. So it's good to go? It's what Beatrice wrote down on her card, Miriam said. It wasn't a lie. It was simply the truth, stripped of the context that made it useful. Perfect, David said, looking relieved. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began typing a quick text with his thumb. I'll let Soph know she can give the printer the green light. You're a lifesaver, Mir. Seriously, I don't know what they'd do without you. They would fail, Miriam thought. The thought was cold, clear, and remarkably quiet. It didn't bring her a rush of anger or a sense of petty triumph. It was simply a statement of physical fact, like observing that water would freeze if the temperature dropped below 32 degrees. The kettle's boiling, she said. She lifted the heavy copper kettle and poured the steaming water over the coffee grounds in the ceramic dripper. The hot water hit the dark mound, and a rich, bitter bloom of coffee oils rose into the cold air. The steam warmed her face for a second, dampening her eyelashes. David pocketed his phone, seemingly energized by having checked one item off his sister's crisis list. He stepped close to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing his chin into her shoulder. Thanks, babe, he whispered, his breath warm against her neck. I know things are a little crazy right now with the launch, but once Thursday is over, everything will go back to normal. I promise. What is normal, David? She asked, her voice soft as she watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the glass pot below. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and kissed her cheek. You know, just us. Regular Sundays. No book stress. He let go of her waist and picked up his travel mug, filling it with the fresh coffee. He didn't notice that she hadn't poured a cup for herself yet. He didn't notice that she had stood perfectly still while he held her, her arms flat against her sides, her body offering no heat in return. I've got to run, David said, grabbing his briefcase. Traffic on the bridge is going to be a nightmare because of the rain. Don't forget about the grocery run for the launch party tonight, okay? Mom said she sent you the corporate card info, but if you need to use ours, just keep the receipt. I have the list, Miriam said. Awesome. Love you. Drive safely, she said to the empty kitchen. The fire door to the garage clicked open, then shut. A moment later, the low, deep rumble of his car engine started up, vibrating through the kitchen floorboards before fading down the street. Miriam stood by the stove. The kitchen was still 60 degrees. She picked up her ceramic mug, holding it with both hands to extract the warmth, and looked out at the dark hemlocks. The first fat drops of autumn rain were beginning to strike the window pane, sliding down the glass like slow, heavy tears. The walk-in dairy cooler at the restaurant supply warehouse was 42 degrees, smelling of cardboard, sour cream, and damp concrete. Miriam stood in front of the metal wire shelving, her breath rising in short, white puffs. She reached for a 30-pound case of unsalted butter, her fingers slipping slightly on the cold, plastic-wrapped cardboard. She lifted it, her thighs straining as she kept her back straight. She set the case onto the flatbed metal cart she was pushing, the heavy thud echoing against the concrete floor. Then she reached for another. 80 pounds of butter, 12 gallons of heavy cream, 5 tubs of whole milk ricotta. The cart's front left wheel had a flat spot, causing it to scrape and squeak with every rotation. Squeak, clack, squeak, clack. The sound followed her through the fluorescent-lit aisles, a rhythmic, irritating companion. She pushed the heavy load toward the dry goods section, her shoulder muscles tightening under her wool coat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a long, continuous vibration. She stopped the squeaking cart beside a mountain of 50-pound bags of semolina flour. She pulled her hands out of her pockets. They were red and numb from the cold of the dairy room. "Miriam!" Sophia's voice was high, vibrating with an artificial, breathless energy. "Oh my God, the printer just called. The plates are locked. They're running the first 1,000 copies tonight. It's actually happening." Miriam leaned against the handle of her cart, watching a forklift driver stack wooden pallets of canned tomatoes in the distance. "That's fast," she said. "Well, they had an opening in the schedule because some local magazine delayed their run," Sophia said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "But honestly, it's because Mom knows the owner of the press. He rushed it for us. Oh, and thank you so much for checking those yeast measurements this morning. David texted me and said you gave it the okay. It's such a relief to know Grandma's original recipes are going to be printed exactly the way she wrote them. It feels so authentic." "You're welcome," Miriam said. She looked at her shoes. They were old leather clogs, the soles worn thin from thousands of hours spent standing on tile and hardwood. "Listen, Miriam, I have a tiny, tiny favor," Sophia continued, her tone shifting into that sweet, coaxing register she used when she wanted to bypass a boundary. "Mom is worried about the crackers for Thursday. She thinks the rosemary crackers from the book might be too dry if we make them too far in advance. She wants to know if you can swing by Miller's Dairy on your way back from the warehouse and pick up 3 wheels of their ash rind goat cheese. She thinks it'll pair better with the fig compote than the store-bought stuff." Miller's Dairy was a 30-minute drive in the opposite direction, down a winding, unpaved country road that would be slick and muddy from the morning rain. It would add at least an hour and a half to her trip. Miriam calculated the fuel. She calculated the ache in her left knee, which always flared up when she drove the old manual transmission station wagon in heavy rain. She calculated the amount of time she had left to portion the flour for the 150 tartlets. "Miller's Dairy is closed on Mondays, Sophia," Miriam said. A brief, heavy silence fell over the line. "Oh," Sophia said, her voice flatting out. "Are you sure? I thought they were open 7 days a week during the fall." "They close on Mondays to clean the vats," Miriam said. It was true. She knew the Miller family. She had bought their cheese directly for years, long before Sophia had decided ash rind looked pretty on a charcuterie board. I can use the French goat cheese from the warehouse. It has the same moisture content. But does it have the ash? Sophia pressed, her tone sharpening slightly. The ash is really important for the aesthetic, Miriam. The photographer is going to be there, and we want the platters to look exactly like the lifestyle shots in the book. It's about the brand. The brand, Miriam thought. A brand built on recipes she had written, being sold by two women who didn't know how to clean a grease trap. I can dust the French cheese with vegetable ash, Miriam said, her voice quiet, steady. I have some in the pantry from the summer preserves. Oh, well, if you think that will look the same, Sophia said, clearly disappointed, but unwilling to do the drive herself. Just make sure it doesn't look messy. Mom is very particular about the presentation. I'll make sure it looks exactly like the photo, Miriam said. Great. You're a star. I have to go. The radio station is calling for our interview. Wish us luck. The line went dead. Miriam slowly lowered her phone. She stood in the warehouse aisle, the scent of cardboard and bulk dried spices, cinnamon, oregano, garlic powder, hanging thick in the air. She pushed the squeaking cart toward the checkout lanes. The cashier was a young man named Jerry, whose family had run the local hardware store down the street from the old Vance bistro for 40 years. He looked at the mountain of butter, cream, and flour on her flatbed and whistled. Big week, Miriam? Jerry asked, scanning a 50-pound bag of sugar with the hand scanner. Looks like you're baking for an army. The book launch, Miriam said. Jerry's face lit up with a warm, genuine smile. Oh, yeah, I saw the flyer in the local paper this morning. The Vance sisters. That's incredible, isn't it? Sophia and Chloe putting out a book. My mom was saying how great it is that they're keeping Beatrice's old recipes alive. She said it must be nice for you, too. You'll finally get a break from doing all the cooking now that they're taking over the family kitchen. Miriam looked at Jerry's hands as they slid the heavy bag of sugar across the scanner. They were thick, honest hands, dirty under the nails from warehouse grease. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply repeating the story that had been written for them. Yes, Miriam said, her voice barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights. It will be nice to have a break. She pulled the blue corporate credit card from her wallet, the one Eleanor had sent with David. She slid it through the reader. The machine gave a sharp, high-pitched beep as the transaction approved. Have a good one, Miriam, Jerry said, handing her the receipt. Good luck with the party. Miriam tucked the receipt into her pocket. She gripped the cold metal handle of the flatbed cart, her boots squeaking on the polished concrete as she pushed the 80 pounds of butter out into the cold gray rain. The kitchen smelled of cold rain and the wet wool of Miriam's coat, which hung dripping over the back of a wooden chair by the door. She had left the 80 pounds of butter on the counter to lose its warehouse chill. It sat in neat, silver-wrapped blocks, looking like small bullion bars stacked against the white tile. Her hands were still stiff from the drive, her fingers smelling faintly of the damp cardboard boxes she had hauled from the station wagon. She picked up her wire dough cutter. Slice, slide, slice. The wire cut through the first 5-pound block of butter with a dull, resisting hiss. She needed to grate the butter while it was still cold enough to hold its shape, then toss it with the flour to begin the lamination process. If the butter got too warm, the pastry would lose its flaky, distinct layers. It would become heavy, greasy, and flat. On the counter, her phone rattled against a stainless steel mixing bowl. The screen lit up, smeared with a thin film of flour from earlier. It was a text from Eleanor. "Miriam, Sophia mentioned that several of her junior league friends are gluten-free now. Can we make the mushroom tartlets gluten-free instead? I'm sure you can just swap the flour for almond or coconut flour. Let's make sure everyone is accommodated." Miriam stopped the wire cutter mid-stroke. Almond flour, coconut flour. To make a laminated 72-layer puff pastry dough using almond flour was a physical impossibility. Almond flour lacked gluten, the elastic protein network that trapped the steam and forced the layers of butter to rise. Without it, the dough would turn into a greasy, crumbly paste at the bottom of the oven. Sophia and Eleanor did not know this. To them, flour was simply a powder that came in a bag, and recipes were merely suggestions that adjusted themselves to their convenience. Miriam looked at the phone. She calculated the energy required to type an explanation. She would have to explain the science of gluten, the structural difference between wheat and nut flours, and why she would have to start the entire 3-day process over with a completely different, non-traditional recipe that wasn't even in the book they were launching. She picked up the phone with 2 fingers. She did not type an explanation. "The recipe in the book is wheat-based," she wrote back. 10 seconds later, the screen lit up again. "But surely we can make a small batch of gluten-free ones, just 30 or 40? We don't want people feeling left out at the launch. It's bad for the brand's image." Miriam set the phone face down on the counter. She did not reply. She picked up the wire cutter again. Slice, slide, slice. She would make the 72-layer pastry exactly as she had always made it, using the unbleached King Arthur flour she had just hauled in from the rain. If Sophia's friends could not eat it, they would not eat it. The responsibility of accommodation belonged to the authors of the cookbook, not the woman standing in the cold kitchen with aching wrists. The back door opened with a sudden gust of wind, letting in a spray of rain and the sharp scent of damp earth. David walked in, holding a large, flat cardboard box under his arm. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his leather dress shoes were darkened with water. "Hey," he said breathlessly. He set the box on the kitchen table, right next to Miriam's clean marble slab. "The binder sent over the promotional posters. Sophia wanted me to bring them inside so they don't get damp. Look at this." He flipped the top lid of the box open. Inside were 50 high-gloss, full-color posters meant for the bookstore windows. The image was a professional photograph of the Vance family kitchen from the old house. In the center of the frame, Sophia and Chloe stood side by side, wearing matching white linen aprons that didn't have a single spot of flour on them. They were both laughing, their heads tilted back, while Sophia held a wooden spoon covered in red sauce. In the background, Eleanor sat at the table, smiling warmly like a proud matriarch. The caption at the bottom read, "The Vance Women, 3 generations of culinary excellence." Join us this Thursday for the release of the Vance Family Table. Miriam looked at the poster. Her eyes didn't linger on Sophia or Chloe. They focused on the copper pot sitting on the stove behind them in the photograph. It was the heavy copper saucier that Miriam had polished with lemon and salt the morning of the shoot, her fingers raw from the acid, so the metal would catch the light just right for the photographer. She had been standing just out of frame, holding a damp towel to wipe up the drips if Sophia spilled the sauce. "It looks professional, doesn't it?" David asked, his voice full of that quiet, prideful satisfaction. He reached out and touched the glossy paper. "They're putting these up in the main library downtown tomorrow. Mom is really happy with how the lighting turned out." He looked over at her counter, his eyes scanning the blocks of butter and the bags of flour. "Did you get the goat cheese from Miller's?" he asked. "No," Miriam said, her hands continuing to grate the cold butter into the bowl. Grack, grack, grack. "I told Sophia I would use the French goat cheese from the warehouse and ash it myself." "Oh," David said, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well, Mom really wanted the Miller's one. She says the local press likes it when we use local vendors. It's part of the whole heritage thing. Are you sure you couldn't have made the drive? It's only an extra 20 minutes. "An hour," Miriam said, "and the dairy is closed on Mondays." "Right, but I don't know, maybe you could have called them? Mr. Miller knows us. He probably would have opened the back door for you if you asked." David sighed, a small, disappointed sound, and picked up his posters. "It's just, we want this to be perfect, Mir. It's a big moment for the girls." Miriam did not look up from her bowl. The grated butter was falling in neat, pale ribbons into the flour, looking like cold, yellow snow. "The French cheese is already paid for, David," she said, her voice soft, flat, and final. David stood there for a moment, the cardboard box held against his chest. He looked at her back, perhaps sensing the tiny, freezing distance that had opened up between them, but unable to find the words to cross it. "Right," he said slowly. "Well, I'm going to go put these in the den so they stay dry." He walked out of the kitchen, his wet shoes squeaking on the hardwood. Miriam reached into the bowl, her fingers plunging into the cold mixture of flour and butter. She began to work them together, her thumbs rubbing the fat into the starch until it resembled coarse sand. Her hands were freezing, but she didn't stop. She kept her eyes fixed on the white tile wall in front of her, counting the seconds between the steady, rhythmic drips of the rain against the skylight above. Dinner was served at 7. It was not the usual Monday fare, the rich, slow-cooked beef stews, or the handmade pappardelle with wild mushroom ragu that Miriam usually prepared to ease the transition into the work week. Tonight, the dinner consisted of 2 bowls of lentil soup, made from a commercial carton of vegetable broth, a can of brown lentils, and a few roughly chopped carrots that had been languishing in the bottom of the crisper drawer. Next to the bowls sat 4 slices of day-old bakery bread, unbuttered, on a plain white plate. David sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open next to his bowl. He stared down at the soup, his spoon hovering over the surface of the pale, grayish liquid. He dipped the spoon in, lifted a single carrot coin, and let it drop back with a soft, watery plop. "Is this the lentil soup?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, though there was a distinct note of hesitation in his voice. "Yes," Miriam said. She sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around her own warm bowl. She didn't have her laptop open. She wasn't scrolling her phone. She was simply looking at her soup. "It's a little different from the one you usually make," David said. He took a small sip, his jaw tensing slightly as he swallowed. "Did you use the smoked ham hock? I don't taste the smoke." "I didn't have a ham hock," Miriam said. "Oh, I thought we had a couple of them in the freezer from the butcher's run last month." "We do," Miriam said, her voice quiet and even. "They're at the bottom of the chest freezer. I didn't have the energy to dig them out." David looked at her, his brows knitting together in that brief, puzzled way that had become more frequent over the last 24 hours. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. He took a piece of the dry bread, tore it in half, and dipped it into the broth. The bread absorbed the liquid instantly, turning a limp, grayish brown. "Right," he said, chewing slowly. "Well, it's healthy." On the table between them, David's phone vibrated. The screen flashed with a succession of text messages from Chloe. David glanced down, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. Oh, God, Chloe is panicking again. Miriam did not ask why. She took a slow spoon of her soup. It was bland, undersalted, and watery. She knew exactly how much kosher salt and red wine vinegar it needed to wake up the lentils, but she did not get up to fetch them from the pantry. She swallowed the lukewarm broth and kept her eyes on the rim of her bowl. "She says she's trying to shoot a quick video for her Instagram," David said, scrolling through the texts. "Some kind of behind-the-scenes promo for the book. She's trying to make the rosemary crackers from Chapter 3, but she says the dough keeps tearing every time she tries to roll it out. She says it looks like crumbly wet sand. She wants to know if you can call her and tell her how to fix it." Miriam took another sip of her soup. She knew exactly what Chloe had done. The rosemary cracker recipe required a precise autolyse, resting the flour and water mixture for 30 minutes before adding the olive oil and salt to allow the starches to fully hydrate. Chloe had undoubtedly rushed it, dumping everything into a bowl at once and immediately hitting it with a rolling pin. Or worse, she had used cold water instead of lukewarm, preventing the fat from emulsifying properly. "Dough can be difficult," Miriam said. "Yeah, but what should she do?" David asked, his thumb hovering over the screen as he waited for a solution he could text back. "She's in the middle of filming. She has a ring light set up and everything. She's stressing out." "Tell her to read the instructions on page 46, Miriam said. "She says she did," David said, his tone nudging closer to irritation now. "She says she followed them exactly. But you know how she is, Mir. She doesn't have your feel for it. Can't you just call her for 2 minutes and talk her through it? It'll take you 2 seconds. Miriam set her spoon down. The metal made a small, clean clink against the ceramic. "I am eating my dinner, David," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was not cold. It was simply a flat statement of physical reality. David stared at her, his phone held mid-air. For a second, the only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. He looked at her face, searching for some sign of resentment or exhaustion that he could soothe with a quick apology or a promise of a nice dinner out next week. But her face was perfectly still, like the surface of a pond under a winter sky. "It's just a phone call, Mir," he muttered, his voice dropping into a defensive mumble. "She's my sister. We're trying to launch a business here." "The book is already printed," Miriam said, her eyes meeting his. "The instructions are locked. If the recipe doesn't work for the author, it won't work for the readers." David flinched slightly, as if the words had a physical edge he hadn't expected. He looked down at his phone, his thumb moving quickly as he typed a response. Miriam watched his reflection in the dark screen of his laptop, his shoulders slightly hunched, his jaw tight. "I'll just tell her to put it in the fridge for a bit," David muttered, not looking up. "That usually fixes dough, right?" "Sometimes," Miriam said. She picked up her spoon and finished her soup. It was cold now, the fat from the commercial broth forming a thin, greasy film around the edges of the bowl. She ate every drop, chewing the undercooked carrots with a slow, deliberate rhythm. When she was finished, she stood up, took her empty bowl and her plate to the sink, and turned on the tap. She didn't wash David's bowl. She didn't offer to take his plate. She simply washed her own single dish, dried it with a clean linen towel, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him sitting alone under the yellow glare of the overhead light, his half-eaten soup growing cold beside his glowing laptop. On Tuesday morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick gray fog that clung to the wet grass and turned the hemlocks into ghostly shapes. Inside the kitchen, the air was still cold. Miriam sat at the long butcher block, a cardboard box of tin tartlet molds resting between her knees. One by one, she lifted the small fluted tins, wiping each one with a dry, lint-free cloth before setting them on the wooden surface. Clink, clink, clink. They were vintage molds made of heavy tin-plated steel that had darkened to a dull gunmetal gray over decades of use. Each one had to be greased individually with a pastry brush dipped in clarified butter. If she missed a single groove in the fluted edge, the pastry would cling to the metal, tearing when she tried to unmold them. She laid them out in neat rows of 10, 20, 30. A soft knock sounded at the back door, followed immediately by the turning of the brass knob. Eleanor let herself in, her keys jingling in her hand. She was wearing a cream-colored trench coat, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, smelling of lavender water and expensive Italian leather. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over the kitchen in a single, practiced movement. "Miriam, dear," Eleanor said, pulling off her soft leather gloves and tucking them into her pocket. "It's so quiet in here. Usually when we have a catering order of this size, I can smell the onions caramelizing from the driveway by Tuesday morning." Miriam didn't look up from her tin molds. Clink. "The onions don't take long once the pans are hot. I'm prep measuring the dry ingredients first." "I see," Eleanor said. She walked over to the butcher block, her heels clicking softly on the pine floor. She picked up one of the clean tin molds, turning it over in her manicured hand. Her fingernails were painted a pale, neutral pink, the color of a clean almond. "These look a bit tired, don't they? Do you think we should have ordered some of those new silicone mats Sophia saw online? She said they make the tartlets look so much cleaner." "These hold the heat better," Miriam said. "The pastry gets crisper at the bottom." "Well, if you say so," Eleanor murmured, setting the mold back down. She didn't place it back in the neat row. She left it slightly crooked, a fraction of an inch out of alignment with the others. "But we must keep the aesthetic in mind. This isn't just a Sunday dinner, Miriam. The local historical society is sending their president. We want everything to look like a page from the book." She looked over at the counter where the 3 white logs of commercial French goat cheese sat in their plastic wrappers. "Oh," Eleanor said, her voice dipping into a lower, disappointed register. "You really didn't get the Miller's cheese, then?" Sophia was so hoping for the ash rind. "The French goat cheese is high quality," Miriam said, her hand reaching for the crooked mold and gently nudging it back into its perfect straight row. "The texture is more consistent for baking. It won't weep in the oven." "Yes, but the story, Miriam," Eleanor sighed, her hand hovering over the plastic-wrapped logs as if she could transform them through sheer disapproval. "The story of the local dairy is what sells the lifestyle. People want to feel the soil of the valley when they eat our food. Store-bought cheese just feels so anonymous. Miriam calculated the energy required to explain that the anonymous French cheese was made by a cooperative of multi-generational dairy farmers in the Loire Valley who had been perfecting their craft since before the Vance family had ever opened a bistro. She calculated the energy to point out that Eleanor had never once visited Miller's Dairy herself, nor did she know that the Millers used commercial silage that gave their autumn milk a slightly sour, metallic aftertaste. She chose the silence. It was a thick, heavy shield. She simply picked up another mold and wiped it with her cloth. Clink! Eleanor waited, her chin tilted upward, clearly expecting a defense, an apology, or a promise to make it up with extra effort elsewhere. When none came, she cleared her throat, her hand dropping back to her side. "Well," Eleanor said, her tone tightening, "I suppose we'll have to make do. But do try to make the presentation look rustic, not cheap." She turned and walked toward the dining room door, then paused, her hand on the frame. "Poor Chloe had a dreadful evening yesterday," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a light maternal sigh. "She tried to do that video for her social media page, and the rosemary cracker dough was an absolute disaster. It kept crumbling to pieces. She was practically in tears. She had to send her assistant out to the gourmet market to buy 3 boxes of imported flatbreads just so she could finish the shoot." Miriam's cloth moved in a slow, rhythmic circle inside the fluted tin. "I thought you checked those recipes, Miriam," Eleanor continued, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked back over her shoulder. "We can't have mistakes in the printed book. It would be highly embarrassing if our readers had the same trouble Chloe did. I do hope you were thorough." Miriam stopped her hand. She looked at Eleanor, at the perfectly tailored trench coat, the smooth, unlined forehead of a woman who had never worked a 12-hour shift on her feet, the polite, weaponized expectation of her gaze. "The recipe in the book is Beatrice's original," Miriam said, her voice dropping into a quiet, chilling register. "It is printed exactly as she wrote it on her card." "Yes, of course," Eleanor said, her expression softening into a self-satisfied nod. "Beatrice's recipes are legendary, of course. Perhaps Chloe just didn't have the touch. Some people have the kitchen in their blood, and some have to work a bit harder at it. I'll tell Chloe she just needs to practice more." She smiled, a brief, polite curvature of her lips that didn't reach her eyes, and stepped out of the kitchen, her heels resuming their soft, rhythmic clicking down the hallway. Miriam sat alone in the quiet. She looked down at the tin mold in her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up her pastry brush, dipped it into the golden, clarified butter, and began to paint the inside of the tin, ensuring every single groove was perfectly coated. Her movements were slow, precise, and entirely mechanical. She was no longer preparing for a family triumph. She was preparing for a funeral, and she was going to make sure the shroud was immaculate. The dry, dusty scent of toasted paper and hot flour filled the kitchen. By 2 p.m, the oven had been running at 400 degrees for 3 hours. Miriam stood before the open door, her face flushed from the sudden wave of dry heat that rolled out, carrying the faint, sweet smell of baking butter. She used a pair of heavy cloth potholders to slide out the first massive sheet pan. On it sat 36 tin molds, each one lined with a pale, raw circle of dough. Inside every dough shell was a tiny cup of crumpled parchment paper filled to the brim with dried pinto beans. Clink, clink, clink. The dry beans rattled softly as she set the hot pan down on the butcher block. This was the blind bake, the crucial, tedious step that set the structure of the pastry before the wet filling was added. If she filled the raw shells directly, the bottoms would turn into a soggy, gluey mass. The beans acted as temporary weights, holding the pastry flat against the fluted tin while the steam escaped. She picked up a small metal spoon and began the delicate process of scooping the hot, dusty pinto beans out of the baked shells and into a large ceramic bowl. Patter, patter, patter. The dry beans made a rhythmic, hollow sound as they struck the ceramic. It was a slow, meditative task, requiring a steady hand so she didn't tear the delicate, half-baked crusts beneath the paper. The phone on the counter rang. The caller ID showed Sophia's name, accompanied by a picture of her smiling broadly on a white sand beach. Miriam didn't answer immediately. She scooped another spoonful of hot beans. Patter. She let the phone ring 4 times before she picked it up, pressing the speaker button with the knuckle of her pinky finger to keep the screen clean. "Miriam, are you there?" Sophia's voice was high-pitched, clipped, and vibrating with an undercurrent of irritation. In the background, the ambient chatter of a busy coffee shop hummed. "I am having the most ridiculous afternoon. The venue manager at the club is being completely unreasonable about the table layouts. And now our publicist just forwarded me this awful email." "What email?" Miriam asked, her hand returning to the sheet pan. She scooped another spoonful of beans. Patter. "It's from some local food blogger, the Valley Fork or something. Apparently, the publisher sent out 50 advanced digital copies to regional influencers last week, and this girl is making a massive scene in our inbox. She's claiming the recipe for the lard pie crust, the one in Chapter 2, is mechanically flawed. She says she tried to make it twice, and the dough just fell apart into greasy sand. She's asking if we have an errata sheet or if the measurements were a misprint." Miriam's spoon paused over a fluted tin. She knew the recipe Sophia was talking about. Grandma Beatrice's lard crust was a masterpiece, but Beatrice had never written down the water. On her index card, she had simply written flour, lard, salt, butter, cold. She had always kept a small, sweat-beaded ceramic bowl of ice water next to her work surface and sprinkled it into the bowl by hand, using her fingertips to judge the hydration of the flour by the way it clung to her skin. During her testing phase, Miriam had spent 3 weeks using a digital scale to measure those exact, fleeting drops of water, standardizing them to the milliliter, so a modern home baker wouldn't end up with a dry, crumbly mess. But Sophia had bypassed Miriam's standardizations. She had copied the authentic index cards directly, eager to get the manuscript to the publisher without waiting for Miriam's final, edited chapters. "The lard crust," Miriam said, her voice quiet. "Yes, the lard crust," Sophia scoffed, her voice sharp with defensive pride. "I told the publicist to tell her She was probably just kneading it too much or using cheap flour. But the editor is getting nervous now. She says if a food blogger is having trouble, we might get bad reviews on launch day. Sophia wants to know if you can write up a quick professional response. You know, explain the science of it or whatever, so we can send it to the blogger and make her shut up. Miriam looked down at her hands. The skin of her fingers was dry, white with flour dust, and patterned with the tiny, faint red marks from where the hot tins had nipped her through the potholders. She calculated the energy required to save Sophia's reputation. She would have to write an email explaining Beatrice's feel method, confessing that the book was missing a critical hydration measurement, and offer a correction that would make the printed version look unfinished. Or she could write a lie, defending a broken recipe and tying her own culinary credibility to a disaster of Sophia's own making. She chose neither. "I can't write an email right now, Sophia," Miriam said, her voice flat, devoid of any apologetic tone. "I have 72 tartlet shells in the oven, and I'm scooping the weights. If I leave them, the crusts will burn." "Well, can't you just do it after?" Sophia pressed, her tone nudging closer to a whine. "It will only take you 10 minutes. Just tell her how to fix it so she doesn't write a nasty post. The local paper is doing a feature on us on Thursday, and we can't have some amateur blogger ruining the momentum." "I have the lemon curd to temper tonight," Miriam said, "and the caramelized onions need to be slow cooked for 6 hours so they're ready for Thursday morning." "Oh, come on, Miriam," Sophia snapped, her polite facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "This is important. It's the family brand. We all have to pitch in right now. I've been on the phone with the florist for 2 hours, and Chloe is spent from her video shoot yesterday. We're all exhausted." "We're all exhausted," Miriam thought. She looked at the 80 pounds of butter, the 50-pound bags of flour, the mountain of tin molds she had washed and greased by hand, and the heavy iron pots waiting on the stove. "I have to go, Sophia," Miriam said, her hand reaching out to touch the screen. "The timer is going off." "Miriam, wait!" Miriam tapped the red circle on the screen. The high-pitched beep of the disconnected call was swallowed instantly by the loud, steady whir of the oven fan. She set the phone down, face down, on the wooden counter. She picked up her spoon. Patter, patter, patter. The dry pinto beans fell into the ceramic bowl, their hollow rattle filling the warm, quiet kitchen. The recipe in the printed book was broken, and she knew it. She had the correction in her blue notebook under her bed, but she would not offer it. She would let the authentic lard crust fall apart in the hands of every reader who tried it, a silent, crumbly monument to the family's impatience. The water in the bottom of the double boiler kept a steady, muffled bubble, sending up a thin plume of steam that fogged the tiles behind the stove. Miriam stood over the heat, her wire whisk moving in slow, rhythmic figure eights through the pale yellow mixture of lemon juice, sugar, and egg yolks. Whish, whish, whish. The metallic scrape of the wires against the copper bowl was the only sound in the kitchen. Lemon curd was a temperamental creature. If she rushed the heat, the eggs would scramble, turning the smooth, velvety custard into a sweet yellow curd of sulfurous metal. If she stopped whisking for even 30 seconds, the bottom would scorch. Her shoulder was numb, a long, dull ache traveling from her rotator cuff down to her wrist, but she kept her pace steady. The back door clicked open. David walked in, his tie already loosened, his trench coat damp at the shoulders. He didn't take off his coat. He stood near the island, his phone held in his hand, the screen glowing bright against the dimming light of the kitchen. "Miriam," he said, his voice carrying a tight, nervous vibration. "Sophia is in a complete panic. That blogger, the Valley Fork girl, she actually posted a video on her main feed. It's a 60-second reel of her trying to make the lard crust, and then she holds up the book mock-up and shows the ingredients list, asking if the publisher even hired a recipe tester." Miriam's whisk didn't skip a beat. Whish, whish. "The recipe in the mock-up is Beatrice's card." I know, David said, stepping closer to the stove, his phone buzzing twice in his hand. He looked down at the screen, then rubbed his forehead. "But people are commenting. Some of the local pre-sales are asking if they can cancel their orders. Sophia says the publisher is already calling her publicist to ask what's going on." He paused, waiting for Miriam to say something, to offer a solution, to tell him how she was going to fix it. Miriam kept her eyes on the swirling yellow liquid in the copper bowl, watching the way it was slowly beginning to coat the back of her wooden spatula. "Sophia has an idea," David said, his voice dropping into a lower, persuasive pitch. "She wants you to make a dummy account on Instagram. You know, just a fake name. You can go into the comments of that blogger's video and post something like, 'Oh, I made this crust this morning and it worked beautifully. You just have to add 3 tablespoons of ice water by hand to bind the lard. Traditional bakers know this.' That way, we don't look bad, the book still looks authentic, and it makes the blogger look like she just doesn't know how to bake." Miriam's hand kept the figure 8 motion. The steam from the double boiler carried the sharp, sweet scent of lemon zest into her throat, hot and slightly bitter. She calculated the energy of the request. They wanted her to create a false identity to anonymously correct their mistake, protecting the public image of 2 women who had erased her name from the very work they were defending. They wanted her to be the invisible mechanic, crawl under the chassis of their vehicle in the dark, fix the engine, and then disappear back into the bushes while they drove away, waving to the crowd. "No," Miriam said. David blinked, his phone still held in front of his chest. "What do you mean, no?" "I don't have an Instagram account," Miriam said, her voice flat, conversational. "Well, you can make one in 2 minutes, Mir. I can show you how. It's just a simple comment. It would save us a massive headache before the launch on Thursday." "I am tempering 72 egg yolks, David," Miriam said. She lifted the whisk, letting a ribbon of the warm yellow curd fall back into the bowl. It held its shape on the surface for 3 seconds before dissolving back into the mass. The curd was almost done. "If I stop whisking to make an account, the custard will scramble." "Not right this second," David said, his tone sharpening, a hard edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "I mean tonight, or when you're done with the lemons. Why are you being so difficult about this lately? It's like every time we ask you for a simple hand with this book, you find a reason to say no." Miriam turned off the gas. The blue flames vanished, and the low, bubbling hiss of the water slowly died down. She lifted the heavy copper bowl off the double boiler and set it on a trivet, her movements slow, deliberate, and quiet. "It is my family name on that cover, Miriam," David said, his voice rising, his eyes fixed on her face. "It's my name, too. If this launch goes badly, it affects all of us. Don't you care about that?" Miriam picked up a clean rubber spatula. She looked at David, at the expensive trench coat his mother had bought him for his promotion, at the clean, uncalloused hands that had never held a chef's knife for more than 10 minutes, at the slight, petulant frown on his lips. "The cover of the book," Miriam said, her voice dropping into a quiet, freezing stillness that seemed to draw the heat out of the small room, "says Sophia and Chloe." David stared at her, his mouth slightly open. The words hung between them in the warm, lemon-scented air, heavy and unresolvable. He looked at her as if he were seeing a stranger standing in his kitchen, someone he didn't know how to speak to, someone who had suddenly stopped responding to the invisible, polite leverage his family had used for 10 years. That's different," David muttered, his eyes flicking away from hers, targeting the floorboards. It's the Vance daughters, Miriam. You know how Mom is about the legacy. It's a branding thing. It doesn't mean your help isn't appreciated." Miriam did not answer. She turned her back to him, picked up her fine mesh sieve, and began the slow, silent process of straining the warm lemon curd into a sterile glass bowl, separating the smooth custard from the tiny, bitter bits of zest that had done their work. She did not look at him when the fire door to the garage clicked open and shut a few minutes later, nor when his car left the driveway to go, undoubtedly, to his mother's house. She simply kept scraping the warm, bright custard through the silver wire mesh, watching it fall into the bowl below in a slow, silent, and perfect stream. David's side of the bed was cold, the linen pulled tight and smooth. He had not returned from his mother's house last night. At 7:30 on Wednesday morning, Miriam sat at the small writing desk in the corner of their bedroom. The pale morning light was thin and gray, cast through the bare branches of the oak tree outside the window. On the desk sat a small rectangular tin box with faded blue paint and rusted corners. It had once held English shortbread biscuits in the 1960s, but now it held Beatrice's most private ledgers. Miriam turned the small brass key in the lock. The mechanism gave a dry, stiff click. Inside the box lay several folded documents, their edges yellowed and smelling faintly of vanilla and dry cedar. She bypassed the handwritten recipe journals. Those were already safe in her canvas tote, and pulled out a legal document bound with a heavy blue paper backing. It was a certified copy of Beatrice Vance's last will and testament, dated 3 months before her death. Beneath the standard language of bequests and assets was a specific, notarized codicil. Beatrice had been a proud woman, but she had also been shrewd. She had watched her daughter Eleanor run the original bistro into bankruptcy through poor management and expensive, vanity-driven renovations, only to blame the changing local market. Beatrice had known that once she was gone, Eleanor and her daughters would view her name as a commercial asset to be sold to the highest bidder. "To my beloved daughter-in-law Miriam Vance," the codicil read in Beatrice's shaky but determined script, "who alone carried the weight of my kitchen when my own blood turned away. I leave the sole ownership and copyright of all my culinary manuscripts, written recipes, and personal journals. Furthermore, I bequeath to her the federal trademark registered under my name, Grandma Beatrice's, including all rights to my signature, my likeness, and the commercial use of my culinary legacy. Miriam ran her fingertip over the raised gold notary seal at the bottom of the page. The family had never asked to see the will. When Beatrice died, Eleanor had simply assumed that because she was the biological daughter, everything of sentimental value, including the recipe box in the kitchen pantry, belonged to her. Miriam had never corrected her. She had simply let Eleanor take the physical index cards, knowing that she held the legal trademark and the true standardized manuscripts. She folded the document back into its creases and turned on her laptop. Her email inbox contained a single unread message from Edward Harrison, an intellectual property attorney whose office sat in a quiet brick building near the county courthouse. Miriam had retained him 6 weeks ago when she first saw the promotional mock-ups for the cookbook on Sophia's dining table. The email was brief. Dear Miriam, we have completed the review of the cookbook draft you provided. The publisher, Crown and Hearth Press, has indeed used Grandma Beatrice's signature on the cover and 5 of her exact copyrighted manuscript pages as chapter separators, credited to Sophia and Chloe Vance. Because you hold the exclusive trademark and copyrights, this constitutes clear infringement. Additionally, the standard contract for Crown and Hearth contains an indemnification clause, meaning the authors, Sophia, Chloe, and Eleanor, are personally liable for any legal damages or copyright disputes, not the publisher. I have drafted the cease and desist letter along with a formal trademark infringement claim. We can serve both the publisher and the authors immediately. Please advise on when you would like us to proceed. Best regards, Edward Harrison, Esquire. Miriam looked out the window. Down in the driveway, the automatic floodlights clicked off as the morning grew brighter. She calculated the energy of the timing. If she had Edward serve the papers today, the publisher would halt Thursday night's launch party immediately. The boxes of books in her hallway pantry would be seized. The family would scream, they would storm her kitchen, and David would beg her to withdraw the claim for the sake of the family. They would frame her as the jealous, bitter daughter-in-law who wanted to ruin their beautiful moment. But if she waited? If she waited until Friday morning, the day after the launch party? By Friday, the 300 pre-sales would have been distributed. The local newspaper's full-page feature on the Vance daughters would have gone to print. Sophia and Chloe would have stood in their white linen aprons, accepting congratulations and taking credit for Beatrice's life work. And then the trap would snap shut. The publisher, facing a massive federal trademark lawsuit, would immediately pull the book from the shelves. They would invoke the indemnification clause, turning their legal team directly onto Eleanor, Sophia, and Chloe to recoup their printing and marketing costs. The 100-year brand of the Vance family would not just be embarrassed, it would be financially liquidated by the very publisher they had hired to celebrate it. Miriam clicked the reply button. Her fingers moved quietly over the keyboard, the soft clack-clack of the keys the only sound in the room. Dear Edward, please do not serve the papers today. Let the launch party proceed on Thursday night. Deliver the formal cease and desist to Crown and Hearth Press and copy Eleanor, Sophia, and Chloe Vance at exactly 9 a.m. on Friday morning. Thank you, Miriam. She clicked send. The email vanished from her screen with a soft digital whoosh. She sat back in her chair, her face illuminated by the cool blue light of the screen. She felt no rush of adrenaline, no sudden thrill of anticipation. She felt only the deep, clean satisfaction of a chef who had finally set the timer on a slow braise, knowing that the heat was constant, the lid was heavy, and the meat would inevitably fall apart in the dark. By Wednesday afternoon, the kitchen was a battleground of onion fumes. 10 pounds of yellow onions sat on the butcher block, their dry, papery skins cascading onto the floor like copper shavings. Miriam's eyes were streaming, a steady, silent run of tears tracking down her cheeks and dripping from her chin onto the wood. She didn't wipe them. The salt in her tears had dried in itchy lines near her ears, but she kept her hands moving. Shh, shh. Her carbon steel chef's knife, sharpened to a razor's edge on a waterstone every Sunday night, moved with absolute precision. She sliced the onions paper thin, root to stem, ensuring they would melt down into a uniform, jam-like consistency. If the slices were uneven, some would scorch, while others remained raw and sharp. She swept a massive mound of white rings into her 12-inch cast-iron skillet, where 3 tablespoons of clarified butter had already begun to shimmer. The onions hit the fat with a loud, aggressive hiss, immediately releasing a dense, sweet cloud of steam that made her eyes sting renewed. The back door clicked open. David stepped in, his movements tentative, almost sheepish. He had changed out of his suit into a pair of worn jeans and an old college sweatshirt. He smelled of his mother's house, specifically the expensive dark roast chicory coffee Eleanor imported from New Orleans. He stood near the entryway for a moment, watching the steam rise from the stove. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," Miriam said. She didn't turn her head. She picked up another onion, sliced off the root, and began the steady, rhythmic peeling. David walked over to the stove. He looked at the massive skillet where the onions were already beginning to soften and shrink, turning from opaque white to a translucent, buttery yellow. He reached into the ceramic crock next to the range, pulled out a metal serving spoon, and began to stir. The hard edge of the metal spoon scraped violently against the seasoned bottom of the cast-iron skillet. Miriam's hand paused on the knife. The sound was a physical violation of the pan she had spent 5 years maintaining, building up a glossy, non-stick patina of polymerized oil that no commercial skillet could replicate. She calculated the energy of the correction. If she snapped at him, he would look hurt, accuse her of being overly sensitive about her kitchen tools, and use it as an excuse to retreat back to his mother's house. Slowly, without a word, Miriam set her knife down. She walked over to the stove, took the metal spoon gently but firmly from David's fingers, set it in the sink, and handed him a wide, flat wooden spatula. "Use the wood," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, flat register. "The metal scrapes the seasoning." David looked at the wooden spatula in his hand, then at the metal spoon in the sink. He gave a small, dry laugh. "Right. Sorry. I forgot the rules." He began to stir again, the wooden spatula moving the onions with a soft, quiet, huff, huff sound. He cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the yellowing rings. "Sophia's publicist got that blogger's video taken down," David said, his tone carrying a light, triumphant lift. She filed some kind of temporary copyright strike because the blogger showed a full-page spread of the layout on her screen without permission. The platform took it down within 2 hours. Sophia is absolutely thrilled. She's calling it a win for the brand. Miriam picked up her knife and resumed slicing. Shh, shh. The irony was beautiful, sharp as her blade. Sophia's publicist had used a flimsy, weaponized copyright claim to silence a reviewer for showing a book page, completely ignorant of the fact that on Friday morning, the entire publishing house would receive a massive, legally airtight trademark and copyright lawsuit from a federal intellectual property attorney. They were celebrating a small, temporary victory while standing directly on the trap door. "That's good," Miriam said, her voice entirely flat. "Yeah," David said, encouraged by her lack of argument. "The publicist said it's all about controlling the narrative before the launch. Oh, by the way, Mom wants to know if you can bring the first 3 platters of tartlets over to the old house by noon tomorrow. Sophia wants to do a live stream on her Instagram, like a behind-the-scenes look at the final prep. You know, showing the platters being garnished in the garden." Miriam didn't stop her knife. "The tartlets cannot be garnished at noon." "Why not?" David asked, his wooden spatula pausing in the onions. "It's just some chopped thyme and a drizzle of honey, isn't it? It'll take 5 minutes." "The honey will dissolve the warm goat cheese if it sits in the sun for 4 hours, Miriam said, her voice level, patient, and completely devoid of warmth. "By 5 o'clock, the pastry will be soggy, the cheese will be weeping, and the thyme will be brown and dry. They must be baked at 4, garnished at 4:30, and served at 5. "Can't you just, I don't know, put them in a cooler or something?" David asked, his brow furrowing. "Sophia's really got her heart set on this live stream, Mir. It's her big promotional push. It's part of the launch schedule." Miriam looked at the white onion rings beneath her blade. She calculated the physical reality of what they were asking. They wanted her to ruin 80 pounds of butter and 3 days of manual labor so Sophia could have 30 seconds of digital content. They wanted her to sacrifice the quality of the food, the very legacy they claimed to celebrate, for the sake of the aesthetic. "I will bring the platters at 4:30, David," Miriam said. "Miriam, come on," David sighed, his wooden spatula dropping against the side of the skillet with a dull clunk. "Why do you have to make everything so difficult? It's just a photo shoot. No one is going to notice if the pastry is a little soft." "Beatrice would have noticed," Miriam said. She turned her head and looked directly at him, her eyes still red and watering from the onion fumes, her face perfectly still. She always said, "If you feed people soft pastry, you're telling them their time is worth more than your respect." David stared at her, the wooden spatula held loose in his hand. He looked down at the skillet, where the onions were beginning to brown at the edges, filling the room with a rich, sweet, and suffocating aroma. He didn't have an answer. He couldn't invoke his grandmother's legacy against the woman who was currently weeping over her recipes. "Fine," he muttered, turning away from the stove and tossing the spatula onto the counter. "Do whatever you want. I'm going to go wash up." He walked out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps retreating up the stairs. Miriam picked up the wooden spatula. She stood over the hot cast iron, her hand moving the onions in a slow, continuous circle, watching them turn from butter yellow to a deep dark caramel. The sweet smell of the browning sugars rose into the damp air, thick and heavy, like the silent, invisible accumulation of an old, deep debt. By 9:30 on Wednesday night, the house was entirely dark, save for the single, harsh white task light shining down from the range hood. Under its glare, the kitchen island looked like a stainless steel operating table. Miriam was flaking the smoked trout. The fish had been caught in the mountain streams 3 days ago, cured with brown sugar and salt, and smoked over applewood chips in a small backyard kiln down the road. She worked with her bare fingers, her touch light but firm, as she slid her thumb between the oily, iridescent skin and the firm, pink flesh. Rip! The skin peeled away in a single greasy sheet, releasing a rich, heavy aroma of cold smoke, salt, and river water. She dropped the skin into a metal scrap bowl and began searching the flesh for the tiny, transparent pin bones. Her fingertips, sensitive from years of handling raw ingredients, felt every microscopic resistance in the muscle fibers, pulling the bones out one by one with a small pair of stainless steel tweezers. Tink, tink, tink. Each bone hit the side of the metal bowl with a tiny, sharp ring. Her phone, sitting on the corner of the marble slab, buzzed with a double vibration. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue rectangle of light onto the clean wood. It was a photo sent to the Vance family group chat. Miriam didn't wash her hands. She leaned over the counter, using her knuckle to tap the notification and open the image. The photo had been taken at the Copper Glove, the most expensive French Revival restaurant in the historic district. In the center of the frame, Eleanor, Sophia, and Chloe were huddled close together in a red velvet booth. Sophia and Chloe were holding up tall, bubbling flutes of champagne, their cheeks flushed pink, their eyes bright with the manic excitement of the pre-launch high. Eleanor sat between them, a glass of dry white wine held near her chin, her face carrying the serene, triumphant smile of a general who had just won a bloodless campaign. The caption, typed by Sophia, read, "Fueling up for the big day, a little celebration before the world gets to taste our heritage. Hashtag Vance Daughters, hashtag The Vance Table, hashtag Cookbook Launch, hashtag Family Legacy." Miriam stared at the photo. Her knuckle left a tiny, greasy smear of trout oil on the corner of her phone's glass screen. She looked at Sophia's hands in the picture. The nails were fresh, manicured in a dark, glossy forest green to match the botanical illustrations in the book. There was no flour under those nails. There was no yellow turmeric stain. There was no dry, cracked skin from 80 pounds of butter or hours of hot dishwater. She calculated the cost. The dinner at the Copper Glove would easily run $400. The corporate card Eleanor had given her for the party supplies had a credit limit of $10,000 paid from the family trust's main account, an account that had been funded by the licensing rights of Beatrice's old bistro name. Her own labor, if billed at a standard commercial catering rate for 80 guests with customized pastry and cured fish, would have cost them over $3,000. She was providing it for free, under the assumption that she was a member of the family. She felt no anger. The feeling was much cleaner than that, a quiet, crystalline realization of her own absolute utility. She was the engine under the hood, and they were the decals on the side of the car. They believed the decals made the vehicle move. She closed the message, locked her phone, and picked up her tweezers. Tink! The kitchen door from the hallway creaked open. David stepped in, wearing his soft gray bathrobe and a pair of slippers. He was carrying an empty water glass. He stopped near the edge of the light, his eyes watering slightly as the heavy, smoky scent of the trout hit him. "Wow," he said, rubbing his nose with his sleeve. That is really strong." "It's smoked," Miriam said. Her fingers continued to flake the fish, breaking it down into fine, even ribbons. "Yeah, no kidding." David walked over to the refrigerator, opened the door, and filled his glass from the filtered water dispenser. The blue light of the fridge washed over his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. He stayed there for a moment, letting the cold air drift out into the warm room. "Did you see the picture Soph sent?" "Yes," Miriam said. "They wanted us to go," David said, his voice carrying a defensive, apologetic note that he tried to smooth over with a quick sip of water. "But I told them you were too busy with the prep. I didn't want to leave you here alone with all this." "Thank you," Miriam said. "They're just so excited, you know." David walked over to the island, leaning against the edge, careful not to let his bathrobe touch the stainless steel. He looked at the mountain of pink trout flesh in her bowl. It's been a long road for them, especially Sophia. She's really put her whole identity into this book. "Yes," Miriam said, "she has." "It's going to be great tomorrow night, Mir," David said, reaching out to pat her arm, but stopping when he realized her fingers were covered in fish oil. He dropped his hand back into his robe pocket. "The weather is supposed to be clear, 60 degrees, perfect for the garden." He looked at the scrap bowl where the trout skins lay in a gray, slimy heap. "Hey, do you want me to take those out to the big bin?" he asked, pointing at the skins. "Actually, maybe let's put them in a Ziploc first. I don't want the garage smelling like a fish market before the trash pickup on Friday." Miriam looked at him. She calculated the physical effort of opening the drawer, pulling out a bag, and handed it to him. "The garbage is fine where it is, David," she said, her voice dropping into that quiet, freezing cadence. "I'll take it out when I'm finished." "Okay," David said, looking slightly relieved that he didn't have to handle the greasy skins. He took another sip of water. "Don't stay up too late, all right? You've got a big day tomorrow. I want you to be able to enjoy the party, too." "I will," Miriam said. "Love you." "Good night," she said. He walked out of the kitchen, his slippers making a soft, rhythmic shuff-shuff against the hardwood until the bedroom door upstairs clicked shut. Miriam stood under the range hood's white light. She picked up the tweezers. She didn't hurry. She searched the pink flesh with her fingertips, finding one last tiny pin bone near the belly. She pulled it out. Tink! The bone fell into the metal bowl. The silence of the house settled back down around her, cold and absolute. On Friday morning, the books would be seized. On Friday morning, the publisher's legal team would descend. But tonight, the trout was perfect, the bone was gone, and she was entirely, beautifully alone in the dark. By 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, the sun had risen into a clear, cold sky, casting bright geometric squares of light across the kitchen floor. Miriam was working the focaccia dough. The dough had spent 36 hours slow fermenting in the coldest corner of the refrigerator, allowing the wild yeast to develop a deep, complex, slightly lactic flavor. Now it filled 2 large, heavily oiled sheet pans, having risen into a pale, pillowy mass covered in tiny, fragile gas bubbles that looked like blistered glass. Miriam poured 2 tablespoons of dark green, cold-pressed olive oil over her palms. The oil was thick and fragrant, smelling of cut grass and black pepper. She held her hands above the dough, her fingers curved like talons, and pressed them straight down to the bottom of the pan. Foot, foot, foot. The wet, hollow popping of the air bubbles was soft and rhythmic under her fingertips. She dimpled the entire surface of the dough, leaving deep oiled craters that would trap the salt and rosemary. The back door chimes jingled. Chloe stepped into the kitchen, carrying a large, empty canvas tote bag over her shoulder. She was wearing an oversized knit sweater, and her hair was pinned up in a loose, casual bun that had likely taken 30 minutes to perfect. She was holding her phone in front of her face, her thumb scrolling rapidly. "Hey, Mir," Chloe said, not looking up as she walked toward the island. "Sophia sent me. We're doing the final walkthrough at the old garden at 10, and she realized we don't have enough rustic wood platters for the bread station. She said you have those vintage ones Grandma Beatrice gave you, the long olive wood ones." Miriam didn't pull her hands out of the dough. Her fingers remained pressed into the cold, elastic starch, holding the craters open for a second before they slowly began to shrink back. "They're in the pantry," Miriam said. "Top shelf, behind the copper molds." "Perfect," Chloe said, finally pocketing her phone. She walked into the pantry, her boots clicking on the tile. The sound of shifting wood and metal rattled from the small room. "Oh, these are gorgeous, Mir. This olive wood has that really raw, gnarly edge. Sophia is going to die. It's exactly the look we need for the rustic table." She emerged from the pantry, clutching 3 long, hand-carved olive wood boards against her sweater. One of them had been a gift to Miriam from Beatrice on her 35th birthday, hand-delivered with a note that said, "For the only woman in this town who knows how to treat a piece of wood." Chloe set the boards on the counter, right next to Miriam's open workspace. Her eyes flicked down, landing on a small blue leather notebook that lay open near the salt cellar. The notebook was open to a handwritten page of flour-to-water ratios, annotated in Miriam's neat, tight script, with several columns of temperatures and fermentation times crossed out and corrected. "What's this?" Chloe asked, her hand reaching out, her fingers, manicured in a pale lavender shade, extending toward the notebook. "Is this Grandma's old recipe book? I thought Mom had the index cards." Before Chloe's fingers could touch the paper, Miriam's hand, oily, smelling of rosemary and yeast, descended onto the blue cover and closed the book with a soft, firm slap. Chloe's hand froze mid-air. She blinked, her expression shifting from curiosity to a brief, startled flash of offense. "It's my prep notes," Miriam said, her voice dropping into that quiet, level register. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. She simply held her hand flat on the leather cover. "Oh," Chloe said, a forced, defensive little laugh escaping her lips as she pulled her hand back. "You're so secretive with your notes, Mir. It's just flour and water. We're all one big family now, aren't we? Besides, everything's in the printed book anyway. It's not like there are any secrets left." Miriam looked at Chloe. She looked at the smooth, unlined skin of her forehead, the lavender nails, the long olive wood boards she had taken from the pantry without asking, treating them like props in a play she had written. She calculated the energy of the secret. The book in the boxes in the hallway, the book that would be released in 8 hours, contained a focaccia recipe that omitted the 36-hour cold fermentation entirely, calling instead for a quick 2-hour warm rise to save time for the modern home cook. Without the cold ferment, the dough would rise, but it would have no structure, no flavor, and would turn stale and rubbery within 2 hours of leaving the oven. The recipe in the book was a hollow shell. The blue notebook under her palm held the actual life of the bread. "Yes," Miriam said, her hand remaining flat on the blue leather. "Everything is in the book." "Right," Chloe said, her tone turning slightly cool as she gathered the 3 olive wood boards and slid them into her canvas tote. "Well, I've got to run. The florist is meeting us at 10, and we still have to hang the fairy lights in the pear trees. Don't forget, noon is when Sophia wanted those first platters over there." 4:30, Miriam said. Chloe paused, her tote bag slung over her shoulder, her brow furrowing slightly. "What?" "I told David yesterday," Miriam said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting Chloe's with a calm, unblinking focus. "The hot food must be baked right before serving. If I bring it at noon, the pastry will be ruined by 5. I will bring the platters at 4:30. Chloe looked like she wanted to argue, to invoke Sophia's schedule, the PR stream, the photographer's lighting. But there was something in Miriam's complete, freezing lack of negotiation that stopped her. It was like trying to argue with a stone wall. "Fine," Chloe muttered, turning toward the back door. "But if the live stream looks rushed, Sophia is going to be really upset. Just make sure they look pretty, okay?" She let herself out, the back door chimes jingling with a brief metallic chatter before the door clicked shut. Miriam stood at the butcher block. She lifted her hand from the blue notebook, picked up a handful of fresh rosemary leaves, and began to scatter them over the dimpled dough, watching them fall into the deep, dark craters of olive oil. They looked like small green pine needles settling into deep water. She felt no rush, no anxiety about Sophia's stream, no desire to please. The dough was cold, the oil was rich, and the Friday morning deadline was drawing closer with every tick of the clock. By 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the kitchen had reached a suffocating dry heat. Both ovens were roaring at 425 degrees, their heavy heating elements humming with a low electric vibration that rattled the small glass spice jars on the shelf above. Miriam was assembling the tartlets. She worked with a small stainless steel offset spatula. She scooped a neat, dark brown dollop of caramelized onion jam, thick, glossy, and sweet, and dropped it into the center of a par-baked pastry shell. Then she took a thin slice of the French goat cheese and pressed it gently over the onions, ensuring it was perfectly centered. Schluck, slice, press. The movement was rhythmic, almost clinical. Her right wrist, bound tightly in a black elastic compression sleeve beneath her rolled-up sleeve, throbbed with a dull, burning heat. She ignored it. She had 72 tartlets lined up on the first massive sheet pan, their fluted edges pale gold and perfectly crisp. On the island, her phone vibrated, scooting an inch across the stainless steel before she picked it up. It was David. "Miriam?" His voice was thin, competing with the background roar of a leaf blower and the clatter of folding chairs. "Where are you? Sophia's publicist is here, and the photographer wants to start shooting the lifestyle table. Sophia is standing by the rustic bread station with her apron on, but she has nothing to display. We need the hot platters." Miriam didn't set down her offset spatula. She picked up another slice of cheese. "The pans are in the oven, David," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying the dry, level tone of a train announcer. "Can't you just bring them over cold and bake them in the oven at the garden house?" David's voice rose, carrying that sharp, high-pitched panic he always got when his mother's brow began to furrow. "We have the kitchen in the carriage house. It'll save time." "The carriage house oven has a broken thermostat," Miriam said. She sliced another round of goat cheese. Slice. "It runs 80 degrees hot at the back left. If I put 3 trays of laminated pastry in there, the bottoms will burn before the cheese melts. I am baking them here." A brief, frustrated silence came over the line, punctuated by the distant sound of Eleanor calling out to a caterer about the linen drape. "Fine," David muttered, his tone dropping into a petulant mumble. "But Sophia is really stressing, Mir. She's got her phone set up on the tripod for the live stream. It just looks empty. She's standing there holding a wooden spoon with nothing to stir." "I will be there at 4:30, Miriam said. "Yeah, okay. Oh, by the way, the delivery truck just left. The final hardback copies of the book are here. 5 boxes of them. Sophia is unboxing them right now. She's literally crying, Miriam. She's signing the first copy for the mayor. It's really beautiful. I wish you were here to see it." Miriam looked down at her sheet pan. She saw the 72 tiny, perfect circles of dough. She saw the caramelized onions she had spent 6 hours weeping over. She saw her own hands, the cracked skin around her knuckles, the yellow turmeric stain that had finally faded from her thumb, the black brace supporting her wrist. She calculated the timing. It was 3:15 on Thursday afternoon. The mayor was holding the book. Sophia was signing her name in gold ink on the title page. In exactly 17 hours and 45 minutes, at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, Edward Harrison's courier would walk into the executive offices of Crown and Hearth Press in the city, delivering a federal trademark infringement claim that would halt the book's distribution immediately. The book Sophia was crying over, the ones she was signing with such pride, were already legally dead. They were nothing but expensive, beautifully bound kindling. "I'm glad she's happy," Miriam said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. "She is. She really is. All right, I've got to go help Mom with the ice chests. See you at 4:30. Don't be late." "Goodbye," Miriam said. She hung up, set the phone face down on the counter, and picked up her heavy cloth potholders. She opened the top oven door. The sudden, intense wave of heat blasted her face, dry and smelling of toasted wheat. She slid the first tray of 72 caramelized onion and goat cheese tartlets into the middle rack. She closed the door, the heavy latch clicking shut with a solid metallic clank. She turned the mechanical timer on the stove. Tick, 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 tick. The little white arrow began its slow, steady countdown toward 30 minutes. Miriam stood in the hot, quiet kitchen, her hands resting flat on the cool stainless steel edge of the island. She felt no fear, no hesitation, no sudden rush of regret. She simply stood there, watching the small glass window of the oven, waiting for the butter in her pastry to melt, to expand, and to rise in the dark. The tires of the station wagon crunched slowly over the damp, crushed gravel of the driveway at the old Vance homestead. It was 4:15. The afternoon sun had dipped below the tops of the ancient sugar maples, casting long, cool shadows across the manicured lawn. In the garden, a trio of high school string players was tuning up under the shade of a weeping willow, the violin's high-pitched, metallic scree, scree of a fifth sliding through the quiet air. Miriam turned off the engine. The car died with a heavy, shuddering rattle, leaving only the soft tick of the cooling manifold. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Her forearms were tight, her muscles humming from the strain of carrying 3 massive, insulated catering boxes down the stairs of her house. The car was filled with the overwhelming, sweet, savory warmth of the baked tartlets and the rich, yeasty oil of the rosemary focaccia. She opened the door and stepped out into the cool air. The breeze was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, and expensive wood smoke from the outdoor fire pits Eleanor had hired a crew to set up near the terrace. She walked to the back of the wagon, lifted the heavy tailgate, and pulled out the first insulated carrier. It was a commercial-grade black foam box that kept the heat trapped inside. She carried it toward the carriage house, her old leather clogs clacking rhythmically against the stone pathway. "Miriam!" Sophia was standing near the rustic wood table, her green linen apron spotless, her hair arranged in elegant, soft curls that framed her face perfectly. She was holding a hardback copy of the book against her chest, her fingers tracing the gold leaf lettering. Next to her, a young man with a large professional camera and a softbox reflector was adjusting his tripod. "You're cutting it so close," Sophia called out, her voice carrying that sharp, breathless vibration of high-stress performance. "The light is almost gone for the live stream. We have exactly 8 minutes before we go live on the main account." Miriam set the heavy foam box on the corner of the stone table. Her gray canvas chef's coat was clean, but it had a faint, dark smudge of caramelized onion grease on the left cuff, and her sleeves were rolled up, revealing the thick black support brace on her right wrist. Eleanor stepped out from the carriage house doorway, her cream-colored trench coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. She looked at Miriam, her eyes flicking down to the grease smudge on her cuff, then to the worn, scuffed leather of her clogs. Her lips thinned into a brief, polite line. "Miriam, dear," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into that low, corrective register. "Do you have a fresh apron? We're about to have the local paper's photographer come through the garden, and we want everyone to look, well, cohesive. The gray coat looks a bit industrial, doesn't it?" "This is what I cook in," Miriam said, her voice quiet, steady, and entirely flat. "Yes, of course, but you're not in the kitchen now," Eleanor murmured, her hand reaching out to adjust the collar of Sophia's spotless white linen. "We want the image to match the book. Sophia and Chloe are wearing the traditional white linen. It looks so much cleaner on camera." Miriam looked at Eleanor's hand. The The skin was smooth, soft, and smelled of rosewater. "I have 2 more boxes to bring from the car," Miriam said. She turned and walked back down the gravel path, her clogs keeping their slow, steady rhythm. She did not run. She did not apologize. She felt the cool air hit the back of her neck, a welcome relief from the heat of her own kitchen. When she returned to the carriage house with the second box, she found a young woman in a black blazer standing by the display table with a clipboard. It was Sarah, the event coordinator Eleanor had hired to manage the pass trays and the Junior League volunteers. "Oh, are you Miriam?" Sarah asked, looking up from her papers with a hurried professional smile. "Great. Eleanor told me you were running the kitchen prep. I just need you to sign this vendor sheet before the guests start arriving so we can clear the catering expenses with the family trust." Miriam set the second box down. She took the clipboard from Sarah's hand. The sheet was a standard vendor log, listing the florist, the musicians, the rental company, and the staff. Halfway down the page, beneath the listing for past hors d'oeuvres / Junior League staff, was her own name, Miriam Vance, volunteer kitchen prep / staff. Next to her name, in the rate column, Eleanor had written N/A, family. But directly beneath that, in the tax classification column, was a handwritten note from the family's accountant listing her $300 worth of bulk grocery receipts as a charitable contribution / volunteer service to be written off against the Vance Family Trust's annual tax filing. Eleanor had not just used her labor for free. She had legally classified her as an unpaid volunteer vendor, transforming her 3 days of physical exhaustion, her standardized recipes, and her raw ingredients into a convenient tax write-off for the family's estate. Miriam stared at the paper. She calculated the sheer, breathtaking depth of the erasure. She was not a daughter. She was not an author. She was not even a guest. On the legal ledgers of the family trust, she was a volunteer utility, a line item expense to be subtracted from their tax liabilities. "Is everything correct?" Sarah asked, her pen hovering over the page. "I just need your signature to verify the delivery of the goods." "It's correct," Miriam said. She took the pen. Her hand was perfectly steady as she signed her name, Miriam Vance, in the clean white box at the bottom of the page. She handed the clipboard back to Sarah, her face entirely still, her eyes reflecting the pale, fading gold of the afternoon sun. "Thanks," Sarah said, already turning away to direct a volunteer carrying a tray of empty wine glasses. "Good luck in the kitchen." Miriam stood by the stone table. In the garden, Sophia's phone gave a sharp, melodic chime. "We're live!" Sophia's voice squealed, instantly shifting into her warm, airy social media persona. "Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vance homestead. We are so excited to finally share our heritage with you tonight." Miriam looked at her signed name on the carbon copy page of the clipboard, then at her own flour-dusted hands. The line had been crossed. The signature was on the ledger. The clock was ticking, and there were exactly 16 hours left before the fire reached the house. The carriage house kitchen was small, drafty, and smelled of old timber and damp stone. Through the cracked glass of the window, Miriam could see the garden terrace. Under the warm glow of the fairy lights, the guests looked like figures in an oil painting. The mayor, holding a small plate, was laughing at something Eleanor had said. while Sophia stood beside them, gesturing with her champagne flute toward the display table of books. Chloe was further off, posing with two younger women near the fire pit, her laughter floating back to the carriage house in high, melodic bursts. Miriam was plating. She laid the warm, caramelized onion and goat cheese tartlets onto the long, hand-carved olive wood boards that Chloe had taken from her pantry. She used a small silver spoon to drizzle each one with a tiny thread of warm, lavender-infused honey. Drip, drip, drip. The honey was thick and golden, catching the dim light of the carriage house like liquid amber. As it hit the warm slate of the platters, a rich, sweet, and herbal scent rose into the drafty room, mixing with the sharp, clean smell of the fresh thyme she scattered over the top. The heavy wood door of the carriage house creaked open. David stepped in, his cheeks slightly flushed from the wine, his tie completely gone now. He was carrying an empty silver tray. "Miriam, they are devouring them," he said, his voice carrying a breathless, excited ring. He set the tray down on the counter with a loud metallic clatter. The mayor's wife took 3. She asked Sophia how she got the goat cheese so light and velvety. Sophia told her it's all in the aeration of the whipped curd, something about a family secret Grandma Beatrice taught her. Miriam's hand didn't tremble. She drizzled the next tartlet. Drip. Sophia's explanation was culinary nonsense. You did not whip goat cheese for a baked tartlet. Whipping incorporated air bubbles that would expand in the oven, causing the cheese to balloon and then collapse into a greasy, wrinkled crater. Miriam had tempered the curd over a double boiler with a fraction of heavy cream and egg white to stabilize it, a technique Beatrice had spent 40 years perfecting and which Sophia had never once witnessed. "The curd is tempered," Miriam said, her voice quiet. "Yeah, whatever she said, it worked," David laughed, grabbing a clean linen towel from the rack to wipe a smudge of grease from his sleeve. "The editor from the Valley Herald is out there, too, Arthur Pendleton. He's been eating the focaccia like he's starved. He's currently cornering Sophia near the willow tree, asking her about the fermentation process. She's doing great with him. She's telling him all about how we use the local spring water to wild ferment the yeast." He looked at the door, clearly eager to get back to the warmth and the noise of the terrace. "I'm going to take this next platter out," he said, reaching for the olive wood board. "You've got about 50 more, right? Keep them coming, Mir. We're running through them faster than we thought." "They're ready," Miriam said. David lifted the heavy board, gave her a quick, distracted smile, and pushed his way back out the door, letting in a sudden gust of cold autumn wind that made the single overhead bulb swing gently on its cord. Miriam picked up another tartlet. A moment later, the door creaked open again. She didn't look up, expecting David to have returned for the second tray. "Excuse me," a quiet, dry voice said. Miriam paused. Arthur Pendleton, the veteran food critic for the Valley Herald, was standing in the doorway. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp tweed jacket and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that had fogged slightly in the warm, onion-scented air of the kitchen. He was holding a half-eaten rosemary cracker on a small paper napkin. He stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind him. He took off his spectacles, wiped them with his handkerchief, and put them back on, his sharp, gray eyes scanning the tiny room, landing on the stainless steel prep bowls, the scale, and finally on Miriam's hands. "Smells incredible in here," Pendleton said, his voice mild, almost conversational. Much better than the garden. The wind is taking the scent out there, but in here, it's quite concentrated. Thank you, Miriam said. He walked over to the counter, his eyes fixed on the neat rows of tartlets. He looked at the fluted edges of the pastry, so thin they were almost translucent, holding their shape perfectly under the weight of the caramelized onions. He reached out, picked one up, and took a small, slow bite. He chewed in silence for 5 seconds, his head tilted slightly, his eyes closed as if he were listening to a faint, distant sound. This is a 72-layer lamination, Pendleton said, opening his eyes and looking directly at Miriam. Classic puff pastry. But you've used lard in the base fold, haven't you? It has that short, savory break that butter alone can't give. Yes, Miriam said. The lard is leaf lard. I rendered it last winter. Pendleton nodded slowly. He looked down at the rosemary cracker on his napkin. I was just reading the digital press copy of the cookbook on my tablet before I came over. There's a curious discrepancy on page 46. The recipe for these very crackers calls for a standard quick mix dough, no autolyse, no cold fermentation. Yet, he tapped the cracker, the cell structure in this cracker is wild fermented. It's been rested for at least 24 hours. If a home baker tried to make the recipe printed in the book, they would end up with a hard, dry biscuit that tastes like flour. He looked at her again. His eyes drifted down to the black elastic compression sleeve on her right wrist, then to the flour dust under her fingernails. Sophia Vance told me out there that she spent 3 weeks standardizing these recipes herself, Pendleton said, his voice dropping into a quiet, dangerous register. But she didn't know the difference between wild yeast and instant dry when I asked her. She told me she just felt the heritage in the dough. Miriam stood perfectly still. The wind rattled the loose window pane behind her, a cold, dry vibration. She calculated the energy of the exposure. Arthur Pendleton was a real journalist. He had spent 30 years writing about the restaurants of the valley. He knew the difference between a vanity brand and a working kitchen. He had spotted the fraud in 5 minutes, simply by tasting the food. The book, Miriam said, her voice dropping into that quiet, freezing stillness, is Beatrice's original notes. Pendleton stared at her. A slow, thin smile crept onto his lips, not of malice, but of deep professional satisfaction. He looked at the olive wood board, then at the grease smudge on her cuff. I see, Pendleton said softly. The printed page is a beautiful thing, Miriam, but it's a shame when the authors can't actually cook the food they're selling. Thank you for the tartlet. It's the only real thing I've tasted in this valley in 5 years. He turned, opened the door, and stepped back out into the cold twilight, leaving the carriage house door to click shut behind him. Miriam stood alone in the drafty room. She looked at the golden thread of honey still clinging to the edge of her silver spoon. The critic knew. The review would go to print. The fuse was not just lit. The spark was already running along the wire, and there was absolutely nothing the Vance family could do to blow it out. By 9:45 on Thursday night, the last of the headlights had swept down the gravel driveway, leaving the old homestead to the cold and the dark. The fairy lights in the pear trees were still lit, their tiny white bulbs casting a pale, unnatural glow over the empty lawn, which was littered with crumpled paper napkins, crushed mint leaves, and the dark, wet stains of spilled wine. The garden smelled of cold ash, damp grass, and the sour, heavy scent of cheap champagne. Miriam was loading her station wagon. She carried the empty black foam catering boxes down the stone path, her body moving with a slow, heavy numbness. Her clogs were soaked through with the cold night dew, the damp leather stiff against her wool socks. Her back was a single, rigid sheet of pain, from her shoulder blades to her hips, but she didn't stop. She hoisted the final foam box into the cargo bay, the plastic latch clicking shut with a dry, hollow sound. She had one more trip to make. She needed to retrieve her clean stainless steel prep bowls and the 3 vintage olive wood boards from the main house. She walked up the steps to the back porch of the main house. The light inside the kitchen was warm and yellow, casting a long, bright rectangle across the gray floorboards of the deck. As she reached for the brass handle of the screen door, she stopped. The French doors leading from the kitchen to the formal dining room were cracked open. Through the glass, she could see Eleanor, Sophia, and Chloe sitting around the long oak table. A nearly empty bottle of expensive champagne sat in a silver bucket between them, surrounded by dirty crystal flutes and 3 open hardback copies of the cookbook. David was not in the room. He was out in the front driveway, his voice carrying in a low, distant murmur as he helped the string players load their cello into a van. "We did it," Sophia said, her voice raspy and dry from 5 hours of continuous smiling and talking. She leaned back against the high leather chair, a half-filled flute held loosely in her fingers. "The publicist said the Herald feature is going to run on page 3 tomorrow morning. She's already got 3 radio stations lined up for interviews on Monday." Arthur Pendleton didn't say much at the end, Chloe murmured, her thumb scrolling through her iPad. "He just took 2 copies of the book and left. Do you think he liked the focaccia?" "Of course he did," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that smooth, unshakable authority. She was carefully wiping a tiny speck of candle wax from the table with her linen napkin. "He knows quality. It's the Vance name on that cover, Chloe. He's been writing about this family for 30 years. He knows what we represent." "Honestly, though," Chloe said, setting her iPad down and leaning forward, her face turning slightly serious, "what are we doing about Miriam? She looked so miserable in that gray chef's coat tonight. When the mayor's wife walked near the carriage house, she actually asked me if we'd hired an outside caterer. It was a bit embarrassing. We want this to look like a family affair, not an industrial operation." Miriam stood perfectly still on the dark porch. The cold autumn wind blew through the screens, carrying the scent of dry pine needles and the damp, sweet smell of the garden. She didn't blink. Her hand remained hovered 3 inches from the brass handle. "Miriam is a creature of the kitchen, Chloe," Eleanor said, her tone perfectly modulated, completely devoid of malice, carrying only the simple, objective weight of a manager organizing her inventory. "She doesn't have the social grace for the front of the house. We must keep her where she is effective. If we let her wander out onto the terrace, it breaks the illusion of the maternal line. The brand requires Sophia and Chloe." "I know, but she did do all the baking," Sophia said, though her tone was light, dismissive, as if she were discussing a reliable appliance she'd recently purchased. "We should probably give her something, just to keep her happy. The holidays are coming up, and we're going to need her to handle the Thanksgiving charity dinner at the club." "I've already spoken to David," Eleanor said, taking a small sip of her champagne. We're going to give her that $500 gift certificate to Williams-Sonoma, the one we won at the country club raffle last spring. It's perfect. It will make her feel appreciated. We can write the cost off as a business expense through the trust, and she can buy herself another of those heavy iron pots she's always fussing over. Chloe let out a short, high-pitched laugh. She'll probably love that. She's so simple about things like that. Give her a piece of French iron, and she'll stay in that kitchen forever. Exactly, Eleanor said, her face settling into a satisfied nod. It's all about management, girls. You must know how to keep your resources content. On the porch, Miriam let her hand drop to her side. She did not breathe in. She did not feel the blood rush to her face. She felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no grief, no sudden spike of adrenaline. The words did not hurt her. They simply confirmed the math she had been doing in the dark for 10 years. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical bun, her face pale, her eyes deep and still. She turned away from the screen door. She did not go inside to get her stainless steel prep bowls. She did not go inside to retrieve her grandfather's olive wood boards. She left them on the counter. She left them to Eleanor's linen napkins, Sophia's gold pens, and Chloe's canvas bags. She walked down the wooden steps, her clogs making no sound on the damp grass. She climbed into the driver's seat of the station wagon, closed the heavy door with a quiet, solid click, and started the engine. The car's headlights swept across the empty terrace, illuminating the crumpled napkins and the dark, wet grass for a fraction of a second before she turned the wheel and drove out into the dark, leaving the homestead behind. It was 10 o'clock on Thursday night. In exactly 11 hours, the courier would arrive at Crown and Hearth Press. The $500 gift card would never be sent. The Thanksgiving dinner would never be cooked. The resource had run dry, and the family had absolutely no idea that they had just finished digging the grave of their own name. By 9:15 on Friday morning, the kitchen was quiet and flooded with cold, bright sunshine. The storm had fully cleared, leaving the sky a brilliant, pale blue. Miriam sat at the butcher block, a small glass bottle of food-grade mineral oil and a soft chamois cloth resting next to her hand. She was polishing her carbon steel chef's knife. Slide, rub, slide. The cloth moved in slow, even strokes along the flat of the blade, applying a micro-thin layer of oil to protect the sensitive metal from rusting in the damp autumn air. The room smelled faintly of clean oil, dry wood, and the lavender tea steaming in her ceramic mug. On the wood of the counter, her phone began to vibrate. It was a violent, erratic rattle that made her tea mug hum against its saucer. Bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. The screen showed Sophia's name. Miriam didn't pick it up immediately. She finished the left side of the blade, turned the knife over, and began polishing the right. Slide, rub. The phone stopped vibrating, fell silent for exactly 3 seconds, and then began to rattle again. Miriam set the chamois cloth down, picked up the phone, and pressed the speaker button. Miriam! Sophia's voice was unrecognizable. The polished, airy tone she used for the public was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, ragged screech that vibrated with a wild, hyperventilating panic. In the background, Chloe was sobbing loudly, her voice muffled as if she were crying into a couch cushion. "Miriam, are you there? Oh my God, you have to help us," Sophia gasps, her breath catching in her throat. Something insane is happening. The publisher, Crown and Hearth, their legal department just called Mom. They've halted everything. They've frozen the distribution to the bookstores. They're pulling the books off the display tables at the library. Miriam picked up her chamois cloth. She didn't raise her voice. Why? They said there's a federal trademark and copyright lawsuit, Sophia wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. Some lawyer named Edward Harrison served them at 9 o'clock this morning. They said we used Grandma Beatrice's signature and her likeness on the cover without legal authorization. And they said the recipes in Chapter 2 and 3 are copyrighted intellectual property. "I see," Miriam said, her hand resuming its slow, steady polishing of the steel. Slide, rub. "They're threatening to invoke the indemnification clause, Miriam," Sophia screamed, her panic rising into a high, frantic pitch. "The editor said if the lawsuit isn't withdrawn by Monday, the publisher is holding Mom, Chloe, and me personally liable for the entire setup, printing, and marketing costs of the first run. It's over $200,000. We don't have that kind of cash, Miriam. The family trust is completely tied up in the old house's mortgage and the bistro licensing. We'll lose everything." Through the speaker, the sound of Chloe's muffled sobbing grew louder, punctuated by the sharp, distant bark of Eleanor's voice, commanding someone on another phone to find out who is behind this. "Who would do this to us?" Sophia cried, her voice dissolving into desperate, wet tears. "Who could possibly own the trademark to Grandma's name? It's a scam, right? It has to be some competitor or some bitter local restaurant trying to ruin us. Miriam, you sat with Grandma for years. Did she ever mention trademarking her name? Do you know who Harrison is representing? We need to fight this. We need to sue them back." Miriam stopped her hand. She set the polished knife down on the clean wood. The bright steel caught the morning sun, reflecting a single blinding line of white light across the white tile of the kitchen wall. She calculated the energy of the truth. She had spent 10 years allowing them to treat her as tap water, a resource that was expected to flow endlessly, without cost, without recognition, and without thanks. She had watched them write her out of their heritage, classify her labor as a tax write-off, and offer her a raffle-won gift card to keep her quiet. The calculation was complete. The ledger was closed. "Beatrice didn't scam anyone, Sophia," Miriam said, her voice dropping into a quiet, freezing stillness that seemed to cut through the static of the cell connection like a blade through lard. "Then who owns it?" Sophia sobbed, her breathing catching. "Who is Harrison representing?" "He's representing me," Miriam said. The line went dead quiet. The ragged, hyperventilating sound of Sophia's breathing stopped completely, replaced by an absolute, suffocating silence. Even Chloe's distant sobbing seemed to freeze mid-breath. For 3 seconds, the only sound on the line was the faint, rhythmic static of the digital connection. "What?" Sophia whispered, her voice suddenly very small, very thin, and completely hollow. "What did you say?" "I said, Edward Harrison is representing me," Miriam repeated, her tone as calm and conversational as if she were explaining how to scale a sea bass. Grandma Beatrice left the sole copyright of her manuscripts and the federal trademark of her name and signature to me in her will. I authorized the lawsuit, Sophia. A long, slow gasp escaped Sophia's lips, a dry, rattling sound like paper scraping against concrete. "Miriam, no," Sophia stammered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. You wouldn't. We're family. David is your husband. This is our legacy. You're joking, right? Tell me you're joking." "I don't joke about recipes, Sophia," Miriam said, her eyes fixed on the clean, oiled edge of her knife. "You wanted Grandma's authentic recipes. Now you have them. I'll see you on Monday." She tapped the red circle on the screen. The call disconnected with a soft, clean beep. Miriam set the phone down, face down, on the butcher block. She picked up her ceramic mug of lavender tea, the steam warming her cheeks as she took a slow, quiet sip. Outside the window, the neighbor's leaf blower began to hum in the distance, a steady mechanical drone that filled the clear morning air. She sat alone in the bright, quiet kitchen, the knife polished, the water hot, and the absolute freezing weight of her silence settling over the valley like the first hard frost of winter. 6 weeks later, on Thanksgiving afternoon, the dining room at Eleanor's house was freezing. The gray autumn sky pressed hard against the leaded glass windows, casting a dull metallic light over the mahogany table. There were no fresh lilies today. There were no gold-inked promotional posters. The large oak sideboard, which had once groaned under the weight of Beatrice's multi-course holiday feasts, sat bare, save for a few empty crystal wine glasses and a stack of paper plates. In the center of the table sat the dinner. It was a pre-cooked, shrink-wrapped turkey purchased from the regional supermarket chain's deli counter on Wednesday night. Reheated in its aluminum tray, the skin had shriveled into a pale, rubbery yellow, while the meat beneath had dried to the texture of balsa wood. Beside it, the gravy sat in a small ceramic boat, not the rich, dark brown giblet gravy Beatrice had simmered for 12 hours, but a pale, watery broth made from a dry powder packet that had already separated, leaving a thin, greasy slick of yellow oil floating on the surface. The cranberry sauce had not been simmered with orange peel and cloves. It lay in a perfect, rigid cylinder on a glass dish, still retaining the ribbed indentation of the tin can from which it had slid. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. Her cream-colored trench coat was gone, replaced by a dark, simple cardigan. Her face looked smaller now, the skin beneath her eyes hollow and shadowed. The settlement with Crown and Hearth Press had been finalized on Tuesday. To avoid a public federal trademark trial, the Vance Family Trust had been forced to liquidate its remaining cash reserves and surrender the licensing rights to the Vance name to cover the publisher's wasted print run costs, marketing expenses, and legal fees. The book had been officially destroyed, its 5,000 copies pulp before they ever reached a bookstore shelf. Sophia and Chloe sat opposite each other, their eyes red and fixed on their plates. Sophia's hands were bare, the forest green polish gone, her nails short and bitten. Her social media accounts had been set to private 3 weeks ago, following Arthur Pendleton's devastating column in the Valley Herald titled "The Hollow Hearth: how the Vance legacy sold its soul for a cover. Miriam sat to David's right. She was wearing a simple, dark charcoal wool dress that draped elegantly over her shoulders. Her sleeves were long, completely covering the black compression brace on her wrist. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap, soft, clean, and entirely free of any yellow turmeric stains. David cleared his throat, the sound dry and loud in the silent room. He picked up his carving knife, his hand trembling slightly as he made a tentative slice into the breast of the store-bought turkey. The knife made a dry, sawing sound against the meat. "Well," David said, trying to force a light, conversational warmth into his voice that quickly fell flat. It smells very nice, Mom. It's good to all be together." No one answered. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Eleanor stared at the gravy boat. Her hand, thin and slightly shaking, reached out and picked up her spoon. She stirred the pale liquid, watching the grease slick swirl and then settle back into its yellow rings. She looked up. Her eyes, wide and desperate, bypassed her daughter's and landed directly on Miriam's face. "Miriam, dear," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying a fragile, cracking edge that she could no longer hide. The gravy, it's just so thin. Do you think, if we brought it back into the kitchen, a little cornstarch or maybe some butter could bind it?" Sophia and Chloe looked up, their breath catching, their eyes fixed on Miriam with a silent, pathetic pleading. They were drowning in the quiet ruin of their own vanity, and they were looking for the tap water. They were waiting for her to get up, take the pan, walk into the kitchen, and perform the invisible magic that had kept their family whole for a decade. Miriam looked back at Eleanor. Her face was perfectly still, her expression mild, polite, and entirely vacant. She did not look at the gravy. She did not look at the dry turkey. She took a slow, quiet sip of her water, set the glass down with a soft, clean click against the wood, and smiled. "I wouldn't know, Eleanor," Miriam said, her voice dropping into a soft, freezing cadence that offered no heat, no comfort, and no rescue. "I'm sure you'll find the instructions in the book." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's hand froze over the gravy boat, the spoon slipping from her fingers and hitting the ceramic with a sharp, hollow clink. Sophia looked down at her lap, a single silent tear tracking down her cheek, while Chloe stared at her paper plate as if it were an open grave. They had wanted the legacy without the labor. They had wanted the flame without the dirt. And now they sat in the cold, staring at the gray ash of a brand they had destroyed with their own hands. Miriam unfolded her linen napkin, laid it across her lap, and began to eat her dry bread. She felt no rush, no anger, and no regret. The kitchen was cold, the stove was dark, and the silence was finally, beautifully her own. This has been a presentation of Crazy Karma Stories. When the quietest voice in the room finally speaks, it is often to write the final chapter. If you found yourself caught in the patient, unfolding weight of Miriam's quiet rebellion, we invite you to subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we believe that every debt is eventually collected, and the slow-burning wheel of justice always finds its mark. Tap the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on Miriam's silent strike. Your support helps us bring more cinematic, long-form psychological dramas to life. Thank you for listening. Watch who holds the keys to your kitchen, and we will see you in the next shadow.